The following compilation features unsettling and spine-chilling tales sourced from Reddit's horror communities. Reader discretion is strongly advised. These narratives may contain graphic descriptions, psychological distress, and themes that could unsettle sensitive individuals. Proceed with caution, as immersion into these eerie stories may provoke fear, unease, and sleep disturbances. Enter this realm of Reddit's creepy horror stories at your own risk, as the line between reality and the macabre may blur within these chilling narratives. Sometimes, I feel like I was destined to be the bad kid. My dad walked out on my mom and I before I could walk, and I remember being angry and confused about it since the moment I could form a thought. To make things worse, my parents decided to name me Dietrich, which is maybe the most skinhead-sounding name you can have. Pair that with some hand-me-down Cochrans and a jean jacket, and you've got yourself a certified red flag. All of this is to say that I was a serious piece of shit kid. I started stealing my mom's cigarettes at 11. I had my first fight at 12. And I probably would have been arrested at 13 if I didn't pin that break-in on my buddy Julian. Mom put up with me the best she could, until I hiked a Dos Equis bottle through the passenger side window of my principal's Chevy and got my second expulsion. It was at this moment that Mom decided serious measures had to be taken before her stupid teen son wound up with an adult-sized rap sheet. Her solution: moving from our little apartment in Cheektowaga all the way to a decrepit crypt just outside of Baltimore. The house had 3 bedrooms, creaking wooden floors, and was way out of Mom's price range. But thankfully that didn't matter, because she had just inherited the place. The house belonged to my grandmother, who I must have met maybe once or twice as a little kid. I have a very distinct memory of telling her she was a shit word because she wouldn't put peanut butter on my bananas. Whatever the reason that drove Grandma away from our little family, it wasn't enough to take us out of the will, even though the house and its inhabitants of dumb pretties, as she called them, was the only thing on it. Mom thought that taking me from one small town to another would be a fresh start. Truth be told, I didn't really care. I didn't have any real friends left back home, and I was already bored of my latest girlfriend, who was some dumb freshman I had no business seeing in the first place. I was 16 and already decided the world was shit, so I didn't give a rat's ass which part of it I ended up in. I spent my first afternoon in the house scuffing up the floors, kicking holes in walls and carving my name into wood that was older than me. Pointless destruction is only entertaining for so long. So after a while I found myself exploring the grounds. I kicked around the weeds in the backyard. I found which of the bathrooms had an actual working toilet. I narrowly stepped on an exposed nail at the top of the staircase. Then I found the 3rd bedroom, the one neither my mother nor I would be sleeping in. This room was full of all of Grandma's dumb pretties, her name for the eclectic collection of shit she gathered in her 80-something years of life. To a respectless teen, there could not be a room full of any uglier, useless doodads in the world, and yet I found myself morbidly curious about each and every one of them. There was a clay figurine of a miner who gave me a good laugh when I twisted his head off and realized his neck was a cork. There were a lot of clocks, none of which ran anymore, a folded flag, and a bunch of little porcelain babies. But above all else, there were dolls. Little, ugly, sackcloth dolls with dead painted expressions. It was all weird, but nothing really surprised me. That is, until I got to the back of the room. I almost hadn't noticed it, but tucked away in a back corner, sitting under a dust-filled beam of light, was a white sheet, draped over what I assumed was a chair. When you make a habit of stealing stuff, you start to look at things a little bit differently than most people. My first thought here was, what could be so valuable that it was the only thing in the room worth protecting from all the dust? I didn't even care what it was, but knowing it was worth something to someone once was enough to pique my curiosity, and without hesitation, I pulled the sheet off. It was another doll. This doll, however, was different from all the rest. It was a woman and would be as tall as one if it stood up. probably standing at least 5'4", or maybe taller. Her body was built more like a puppet than a doll, with ball joints at the wrists and elbows and shoulders, anywhere a person's arms or legs would bend. The doll's silhouette was almost perfect, if not for her arms and legs feeling a bit too long and lanky, and the paint that would be her skin was starting to chip and peel to reveal the wood beneath. That is, everywhere except for her face. My God, her face. I still have trouble describing it now. It was perfect, made of porcelain or something like that, much finer than the wood. If you weren't looking close enough, you'd swear it was the face of a real girl. A young, black woman, to be precise, probably my age or a bit older, with long, curly, real hair falling over her face. That face was flawless, not like the rest of its body, with not even a chip in the paint to break the illusion. I remember reaching my hand out to touch it, but stopping, completely wigged out by the thing. She didn't even have minor imperfections you might find on an actual person's face. She looked like one of those Renaissance statues, unbelievably lifelike to the point of being better than reality. Her cheekbones were perfectly carved or molded onto whatever material the face was made of. Her nose had little nostrils, and her lips even parted ever so slightly into what was almost a smirk. The only thing that broke the illusion were her striking, golden, glass eyes, which stared perfectly forward, lacking in that look of life real people had. My trance was interrupted by the sound of my mom entering the room behind me. "Dietrich, I swear to God if you keep kicking holes in my walls." She saw what I had found, and her face instantly broke into a pout. Her eyes were immediately trained on the doll, and I quickly moved my hand away from it. "What is this thing?" I asked. I didn't have to specify what. "Her name is Calliope," Mom responded. She had a scolding kind of tone, probably hoping I would show more respect to my late grandmother's things. "Your grandmother bought her at a carnival in France when she was about your age. She said she was made by some famous doll maker, and that she had always wanted one of his dolls ever since she was a little girl." "Neat," I said, a bit disinterested now that I had more context. "Yeah, your father always liked her too." It was my turn to pout now. Mom had broken the no dad talk rule, and then had simply walked out of the room with nothing more than a "dinner's at 8." I looked back at the doll. I was now convinced she was nothing more than just that. Some fancy doll bought from a creepy doll maker in France, the homeland of creepy weirdos. My frown deepened a bit as I realized exactly what I was thinking. Did I actually believe she was more than that? It was almost a month later before I thought about Calliope again. I had spent the night drinking with a couple of guys and this girl, Veronica, from my class. It was a pretty uneventful night, but I still remember stealing a couple of six-packs from this guy, Kevin's dad, and that I thought I had a chance of getting with Veronica if the cops hadn't shown up. The rest of it is more or less of a blur, up until I hopped the fence into my own backyard. It was late by that point, probably way past midnight. I had cut through a few neighbors' backyards to be sure that I had lost the cops, but I also didn't want to go through the front door in case Mom was there waiting to lecture me. I fell on my ass coming over the fence, and as I kicked through the weeds and tall grass, I realized I hadn't really been back here yet. It wasn't too hard to find my way around, though, thanks to a big, bright full moon in the sky. As I stumbled towards the house, I remember my leg getting caught in some tall weed, which was strong enough to wrap around my ankle and stop me for a second. As I knelt down to tug myself free, I noticed a weird, white patch in the middle of the yard, reflecting the moonlight. I ran my fingers over it and realized it was concrete, a rectangle foundation, about 4 feet long, with an uneven surface. I figured there must have been a shed there at some point. Got my leg free and went inside. I climbed through the kitchen window and up the staircase towards my bedroom. I thought all of my stealthiness was for nothing when I kicked something in the hallway just outside of my mom's room. She didn't seem to wake up, and I cursed under my breath and carefully made my way past several obstacles in the pitch-black hallway I remember being empty when I left for school that morning. When I got to my room, I went straight to bed, not even taking my shoes off. It wasn't long before I started getting this weird feeling, like I was being watched by someone else in the room. I glanced around, and even though it was dark, I was pretty sure nobody was there. I would have seen them, right, some silhouette of a person, or I would have heard them breathing, or moving, or something. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling and found myself glancing at a corner of the room just by my dresser. Even when I fell asleep, I would wake up several more times in the night and look back over at that same spot, sure that someone was there watching me. The next morning I knew why when I saw Calliope slumped over in a chair in that very same corner of my room. I marched through the hallway, now tightly packed with boxes of Grandma's doodads, straight to Mom and asked her why that creepy fucking doll was in my room. She rolled her eyes. I need space in that bedroom for my home office, and it sure as hell isn't going in my room or out in the living room to creep out guests. I didn't listen and dragged the doll out into the hallway before going right back to sleep. When I woke up later, she was back in my room, so I dragged her back out again. This cycle repeated for a few days, until eventually I just had to live with the fact that I was always going to wake up to that doll staring at me. I Saturday there one morning, just staring into her cold, motionless eyes. They were so shiny and perfect, even after all this time, that I could see my own reflection in them. Grandma's weird-ass doll was becoming more than a creepy, unwanted presence in my life. She was becoming an intrusive mockery of my defiance. That night, I decided to get rid of her. I grabbed the doll's arm and dragged her out into the living room. I wasn't just getting rid of the problem. Now I was making a point to Mom, showing her why I wasn't to be fucked with. I laid the doll's head against the bricks of the fireplace and stomped my boot down on her jaw. Instantly, I felt strange, watching that perfect, lifelike face shatter like glass. My dramatic execution felt, for a moment, like it had a real victim. But then seeing the portions of her human face split into uneven pieces was like an uncanny reminder of just how good this inanimate thing was at mimicking life. I know now that in that moment, her little glass eye was staring back up at me. I left the shattered doll and went to sleep. When I woke up, she was back in her chair, as intact as the day I found her. I was quiet at breakfast that morning. I remember I couldn't touch my food and couldn't bring myself to make eye contact with my mother. I didn't say a word when she said, "I'm glad you stopped being stubborn about that doll." I would have thought a boy your age would be thrilled to have a girl in his room. She laughed. I didn't tell her about Calliope. I never believed in the supernatural, but I immediately knew something was wrong with that doll. I'm not ashamed to admit that I was scared shitless, and I was afraid of what might happen if I went to my mom about the doll. Not that she would even believe me. I made it a rule not to bother Calliope. I wouldn't even touch the doll again, which also made my room a place of never-ending tension. I hated when I had to go in there and started to sleep on the couch in the living room or at a friend's house. When eventually I had no choice but to sleep in my own bed again, I would spend hours every night laying awake, staring at the doll, knowing that the moment I looked away, she would get her revenge. Time went on, and the revenge never came. Slowly, I stopped being afraid of Calliope, but I still stared at her. It became less of a defense mechanism and more admiration. I admired the doll for her beauty, how still and perfect her face was, how striking her yellow eyes were behind the sheen of glass. Before long, Calliope was becoming all I could think about. I'd drift off during class, thinking about her eyes. I'd call girls by her name by complete accident. I even became less of a troublemaker, because all I wanted to do at the end of the day was come home and stare at the doll. It wasn't long before I was talking to her, telling her about my day, and even sitting her next to me on the bed as I did so. My head was always clearer around Calliope. She never spoke back, but I could swear she understood everything I was saying, like she understood me, in a way no friend or girl ever had. She didn't need to say anything to prove it. At the same time, I was starting to have nightmares. I dreamt about nails in the floorboards. I dreamt visions of my staircase, growing longer and steeper and darker as I stared at it. I dreamt about a malevolent, faceless being pressing its ear up against my door, a shadow in the backyard beneath the moonlight, and a woman standing at the top of a staircase, staring down at me. The dreams were always obscure, with an ominous feeling about the unclear images I saw in them. This didn't stop me from waking up in a panic, sweat on my forehead and clutching my chest like I might have a heart attack right then and there. Then, I'd look over at Calliope, and everything would be okay. The panic would stop. I'd catch my breath, and I'd be able to fall back asleep knowing that she was watching me sleep. It didn't get by me that my closeness to Calliope was making Mom uncomfortable. Occasionally, she would hear me talking through the door and come in expecting to see a friend or a girl, and instead see Calliope laying limp as ever in her chair. She always looked at the doll with fear, kind of like I looked at her before Calliope and I had started to get along. The look would only get worse when she glanced back at me. The kind of look I'm sure plenty of people get from their families before being locked up in an asylum or something. It's probably for this reason that Mom sent me to live with my great-uncle just under a year after we had moved into the new house. She gave plenty of reasons. Great-uncle Abel was coming down with Alzheimer's and needed someone to take care of him. I was hanging out with the wrong crowd, which was why we left New York State in the first place. She even let her true colors show a bit the night before I left, snapping, "You're too damn old to be talking to dolls," before hiding her head in her hands and quietly sobbing at the dinner table. I didn't fight it. I had no reason to stay, though I kept thinking to myself what a shame it would be to leave Calliope behind. I spent a few years with Uncle Abel, and for the most part, they were uneventful. Abel's Alzheimer's was more or less easy to deal with, at least for a while, and by this point, I had more or less calmed down. Calliope did that to me, and even though she wasn't here, I could remember her calming presence whenever I found myself getting angry. I found myself missing her, the way someone might miss an old friend with whom they left things unsaid. It was weird. I knew it, but I knew that Calliope was more than just a doll, so it didn't bother me. In the autumn, I'd look up at the golden moon and smile. It reminded me so much of her eyes. At some point, Uncle Abel asked me if I had any girls in my life. Without thinking, I blurted out Calliope's name. "Calliope," Abel repeated, and I was immediately embarrassed. I shook my head and was going to explain it away when he said something that caught me by surprise. I thought she wasn't around anymore. Eventually, Uncle Abel's Alzheimer's became too much for me to handle on my own, and we had to move him into a home. I was 18, didn't have a job, and had no real choice but to move back in with my mom. Mom and I hadn't kept up much since I left, but nothing could have prepared me for what I saw when I came back home. The house was dirty and uncared for, even more than when we had first moved in. Mom had developed a drinking problem while I was gone, the evidence of which was littered all around the house. It was a conscious sort of mess, with empty bottles stacked neatly in corners or on countertops, cared for just enough not to leave them lying about, but not enough to throw them in the garbage. Despite this, or maybe because of it, Mom seemed really happy to have me back. She hugged me tight at the door and welcomed me home. She asked if I wanted anything to eat, despite the fact that the kitchen end was clearly in no shape to cook anything in. "No thanks," I said. "I just want to go to bed." I was half lying, and she could tell. She told me the hallway was kind of a mess. If I didn't want to deal with cleaning it up, I could just sleep on the couch, or on her bed, even, and she'd sleep in the living room. I told her to stop being ridiculous and broke away from her hug, despite her clear reluctance to let go. I climbed up the stairs, very nearly stepping on an exposed nail at the top step, and turned down the hall to my room. It was packed with boxes, clothes, rolled up carpet, and even furniture. It looked less like the lazy storage solution Mom would have me believe it to be, and more like a barricade. I picked through the stuff easily and approached the door to my old bedroom, only to find myself frouncing in place. My hand on the doorknob trembled. I found myself wondering, what if she wasn't in there? What if she was? Which would be worse? I felt riddled with anxiety, thinking of all the things I would have to say and how I would say them. I was worried that Calliope wouldn't understand, wouldn't forgive me. I felt like she would ask where I was all those years, and I wouldn't know how to answer. I swallowed my nerve and opened the door, and there she was, sitting in the corner like she always had, motionless, without a sound, perfect in her stillness. I sat on the bed across from her and held her hand. It was the same painted wood it always had been, but to me, it felt warm, familiar. Calliope was still here, and I was back, and there was nothing that needed to be explained. We were back together, and that was all that mattered. The nightmares started again that night, nails in the floor. Something dark, something terrible trying to get into my room. A girl in the backyard, staring up at my window, illuminated by the amber moonlight. The next year or so was rough. Mom and I would break into constant arguments, with almost anything triggering a shouting match. I was tracking mud in the house. I was staying up too late. I was apparently stealing her booze right out from under her nose. Anything would start the argument. But I felt deep down it was always related to the same thing, Calliope. She seemed to hate her, and it drove her crazy how close we were. It became clear to me that the 2 years Mom had spent alone in the house with the doll had taken their toll. She wasn't the same person I grew up with. She was always angry or paranoid, and I would often come home to see her sobbing at the kitchen table. She lost her job, was behind on the mortgage, and almost never allowed herself upstairs. I often wondered what sweet Calliope could be doing to make her so upset. I started to question if the scratches in the furniture and the broken objects littered around the house were my mom's doing after all. I remember needing to get out one night. I ended up going to a party, invited by the friends I made when I was still in school. It was a pretty mediocre get-together, but exactly the break from Mom's manic crazy that I needed. Veronica was there, and to my surprise, still into me. I chatted her up, and when she flirted with me, I flirted back, but the whole time my mind was on Calliope. After a haze of drinks, I was back in my bedroom, and I was so sure I brought Veronica there. I was staring at my feet at the edge of the bed, and was going to turn around and tell her that I just couldn't get it up, when to my surprise I was met with the sight of amber eyes. It was Calliope, laid out on my bed. I knew I hadn't put her there, but here she was, and there Veronica wasn't. I climbed over to her. I reached out to touch her hand and gasped. It didn't feel like wood. It felt like skin, the most perfect, soft, womanly skin I had ever felt. As I looked up her arm, I could see that it was free of the blemishes and chipped paint from before. It was as if a real woman was in my bed, only motionless, and yet I still felt her inviting me forward, asking me to continue without a voice. I looked into Calliope's eyes and she looked back. I cupped her cheek and kissed her, and her lips were the most perfect lips I have ever felt. I knew in that moment what I had felt for so long. I was in love with Calliope, and I didn't care how strange it felt. I knew she loved me back. "I love you," I spoke, more of a moan than a whisper. I felt darkness looming at my door, and at the sound of my words it flew open. Mom stood there in the doorframe, tears staining her face, a bottle in her hand. She screamed at me, asking what I was doing, both of us knowing it was a rhetorical question. I pulled myself off of Calliope and sat up straight at the foot of the bed, embarrassed, but still not letting go of her hand. Mom screamed and sobbed. "Look at you," she shrieked. "In bed with that fucking whore." I was confused, but I was also angry. I stood up and told her to take it back. I shouted at her, shouted that Calliope was not a whore, that she had no right to speak to her like that. In response, Mom pushed past me and chucked the bottle at Calliope's head. I was seeing red now, and I shoved her out of the room and into the hallway. She stumbled a bit, and I was brought back to the reality of the situation a little when I saw her almost tip over. I never once thought I could lay hands on my mother like that. It had never once crossed my mind, never felt possible, and here I had almost pushed her over. I cursed under my breath and slammed the door. I tried to walk right out the front door, down the street, anywhere I could get away from my mother and get my head straight, but she caught me on the stairwell. "Please, don't go," she stammered, tears running down her face and choking her words. "Don't leave me alone here with her. Not now. Not after that." I tried to shoo her off of me, but she latched onto me like her life depended on it. I tried to tell her to calm down, that nothing was going to happen. I said I needed to go, but she just kept shaking her head, sobbing, screaming that she was going to kill her. I shouted at her that it was just one of Grandma's dolls, and nothing else. Something I didn't even believe. How could a doll ever hurt her? I asked. "Because my mother never bought that doll," she shrieked. I was confused and tried to take a step back, but she was latched onto me. She fell quiet for a minute, choking on her own tears, before continuing, trying to be more clear before her panicked, frantic sobbing. "Calliope was your grandmother's maid. That little French whore was always flirting with your father, always giving in to his advances, always." I was immediately stunned by the mention of my dad, and she could see the expression on my face change. Her tone became more frantic, more defensive. I was 16 and pregnant, and he was going to leave me for her, that little slut. So I pushed her down the stairs. She shut her eyes, probably unable to stand the judgment and the shock in my gaze. I pushed her down the stairs, then I buried her with Daddy's cement out back. It was like she was reverting back to that little girl as she spoke. She opened her eyes, which were red from the strain and crying, and shouted in my face, "I killed her, and now she's going to kill me. You can't leave. Dietrich, you can't let her kill me." I was shocked. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, and she just kept shaking me, rocking me back and forth as she tugged on my shirt. I whispered for her to stop. Then I said it outright. Then I shouted it and shoved her when she didn't let go. Her grip on my shirt slipped, and she stumbled backward, stepping onto the exposed nail at the top of the staircase. She shrieked in pain and tumbled backward, the nail tearing through her foot as she collapsed down the flight of stairs. I was frozen in shock, watching as she hit every stair on her way to the bottom. I had to catch my breath before I followed her down, slowly ascending every step, careful not to step on the smeared blood and shifting all of my weight on the banister, feeling like I might collapse myself. Mom was laying on the floor at the foot of the staircase, a twisted mess of a person. A hole was torn from the center of her foot outward through her toes. Her neck was crooked, bone jutting out where it bent at an impossible angle. Her right arm was beneath her body, her left one bent backward, and her legs folded. She lay there still, looking like a discarded doll, and if not for her, wheezing could have well played the part. "Please," she whined, staring up at me through the tears and blood in her eyes. "Dietrich, please. Dietrich, please." I clutched my mouth. I was staring at my mother, broken in a way no boy should ever have to see a parent. I was also looking at a murderer, a killer who had just confessed to ending an innocent life out of jealousy. Not just any life, either. My Calliope, who had once lived, only to be robbed from life too early by the woman on the floor in front of me. "Dieter, but please." I looked back and saw Calliope. She was sitting at the top of the staircase, her head leaning against the banister. I looked at her amber eyes, and for once swore I could see something in them. Real emotion. Delight. One look in her eyes and I knew what I had to do. I looked back down at the crippled creature on the floor below me. All pity and fear had left me, and I raised my leg and broke my boot down on her jaw. I dragged my mum's body out the door and stuffed it into the trunk of her Cadillac and let it drift on neutral into a local river. As I watched it sink beneath the inky murk, I remember looking up at the sky, finding it remarkable just how yellow the moon was that night. When I got home, the blood trail leading down the staircase and out the door was completely gone. As I walked up the stairs, I noticed that even the nail jutting out of the top step was missing. The door to my room was open, and there lay Calliope, waiting for me. I held her to my chest and slept dreamlessly through the night. The next day I told the cops what my mom told me. I said she confessed to the murder of a girl about 19 years ago, just before running off with some guy she met at a bar in town. They had their questions, of course, but the forensics on the body dug up in my backyard showed that I would have to be a really murderous baby if I was responsible. Mom apparently made a reputation for herself as a drunk while I was away, and with no signs of struggle, the cops had no trouble believing my story. All of that was back in October. I sold the house to a family friend who reached out not long after Mom went missing, and I hear from him every now and then. Calliope and I are living in a one-bedroom apartment in Betteron now. I think she likes the beach. I'm hoping we can move to France someday, somewhere with a beach. I don't regret what I did, even if I wish my mother was still the person she was before we moved into that house. I know that all of that was a lie. She was a killer the whole time. Anyone who would rob the world of an angel like Calliope deserved what they had coming. I'm making this post because I recently got a call from the guy who bought that old house. He usually calls me every other week, sometimes to check in, ask if I heard from my mom, who is technically wanted for murder, so why would I tell him if I did? And sometimes to ask mundane questions about the house. This time was different though. After his usual small talk, he asked me about the doll I left among my mom's stuff. You know, the one that kind of looks like her, except for the yellow eyes. I'm leaving now, before Mom's doll can get me like Calliope fought her. I'm never setting foot in that house again, and I hope when I'm gone this post can maybe clear things up a bit. I'm not scared though. Cautious, sure, but I have Calliope here to protect me. We're together now, and nothing is going to tear us apart. As I'm writing this, though, I keep glancing out my window. I can't help but feel anxious about how unseasonably yellow the moon is tonight. I don't know how much time I have left, but I feel I need to get this out. Someone needs to understand my mistake. My name is Jean-Paul Allard. I'm 87 years old, and I am going to die. I wouldn't fault anyone if they assumed it was simply age that was catching up with me. But no, most people would never assume I was over 50 when they saw me. Some would say I've lived a good life, and that is the reason for my youth. But I know differently. I know it has to do with them, with those creatures I created all those years ago, the ones that hunt me now. As a child, I spent much of my life around death and dying. I was a child when the Germans came with their monsters and overtook us. I watched family and friends die at their hands as they resisted until their last breath. I ran supplies for the French resistance until the end of the Second Great War, and when it was finally over, my family devoted themselves to trying to return beauty to our beloved France. They were artists, my mother and father. They could see beauty in even the most mundane of things. But all I ever saw was horror. I was young when my home was ravaged, and it left an impression on me that carried over into my adult years. Where my parents could create peace and serenity, I could only make chaos and pain. I did my best to take after them, to see the beauty in all things, but I was raised in a dark time, and I witnessed nothing but darkness for too long. So my work reflected that darkness that I had seen in everything. My parents would still compliment my work, saying they could feel the pain and the hurt being conveyed through my pieces. I told them I wanted to see beauty, and they would reply, "There is beauty in pain, Jean-Paul. Just remember, not all beauty is found in the serene." I continued my artistic pursuits, and at one point I found myself invited to share my pieces at a gallery in New York City. My parents couldn't be prouder. Still, the sorrow and pain I felt remained a predominant part of my life. The horrors of what happened to my people, and the darkness in the years that followed, remained a prominent feature in my formative years. And when I made it to New York, I only discovered new forms of this shadow. The gallery show was a huge success, and I made a decent little stipend. The owner of the gallery, a man with piercing blue eyes by the name of Luciano, informed me that he wanted to see more of my work, and he wanted to commission a few specialty sculptures, to which I gladly agreed. After all, how many could say they made their living as an artist in New York City? Things were going quite well for me, and the shadow was starting to lift. My work took on a brighter tone, and those who had come to enjoy my work were not pleased. They enjoyed that darkness, reveled in the evil I showed them, and I couldn't journey back into the dark. When Luciano inquired about the sudden change in my work, I told him honestly that I had spent a long time seeing nothing but pain and darkness in the world, and now that things were starting to change for the better, I didn't see that dark side of humanity any longer. He told me not to worry about it, that my current work was wonderful, and that I should be proud. There was something about the way he said it, though, like he was trying to smile through gritted teeth. I'm certain he was displeased that I wasn't making him the same money that I had been, but for the first time, I could see the beauty my mother and father created. Then I was attacked. I don't know if Luciano had hired the men or not, but one night as I left the studio, a group of men jumped me in an alley. They beat me within an inch of my life, spewing insults as they assaulted me. I was left lying in an alley, several of my ribs most certainly broken, just like that. The bucket of sunshine that I had started to fill was kicked over, and I was left in the dark again. They came to me in a sort of fever dream. I was recovering in hospital from the beating I had endured, and at some point, I had come down with an infection. I lay in the bed, sweat soaking the pillow when the shadows first took form. They offered me a chance to recover. All they wanted in return was to come to this world, to be given forms by someone who had been touched by horror. I was sick, presumably dying. I shouted that I would do whatever I was asked. I swore I'd create bodies befitting the nightmares they were if they just kept death at bay. The next day I was fine. My injuries had miraculously fully healed, and my fever disappeared. I was kept for observation for a few days, but soon I was back on the street and I had a project to create. I had promised these shadows a body, and for some reason, I believed I owed them. The first draft was terrible. I used stone to try and sculpt my vision of the things I had seen, and I hated it. Every night I dreamt of them, their forms souring my every thought. It was like they wouldn't let me forget them. For the second draft, I used an old weaving technique my grandmother had taught me when I was a child, collecting pliant sticks and weaving them together to form an intricate body and arms. I liked this more than the stone. It created the image that plagued my mind more clearly. Something was still missing, though. I couldn't quite place it, but I knew I wouldn't be able to truly bring this sculpture to life without it. The inspiration was found one night after Luciano had visited me. As we were talking, he shooed away a stray black cat, and something in my mind clicked. I realize now that I should never have spilled more blood to create this monster, but it plagued me. One pelt was not enough, and I found myself hunting the dark-furred strays nightly for nearly a month to collect enough to create what I wanted. I used their bones and claws to create the creature's hind legs, and soon enough the first shadow was near completion. I just needed to create its face. I should have stopped. I should have realized the dark path I was walking, but all I've ever known was pain and horror. To me, this was nothing new. It was simply a unique artistic process that I was using to create something wonderful. I should have stopped. I agonized over the perfect face for the creature, eventually purchasing a collection of variously sized taxidermy eyes in an attempt to find the perfect pair. Nothing spoke to me, and the image in my mind never showed its face, so I could no longer rely on it. "Help me," I remember saying to the unfinished, faceless thing. "Help me find your face, please." I passed out after hours of fruitless labor, drifting back into a sea of despair as the muses abandoned me once more. When I woke, I was surprised. There was a small collection of what looked like folded leather sitting next to my desk, alongside a pair of eyes and what looked like an entire bowl full of teeth. As I held up the leather, I marveled at how supple it was, and the tone. It seemed almost human. It was perfect. I stretched the leather over the shape of the creature's head and collected the eyes. They were unique as well, large and bloodshot blue eyes. The plastic even seemed to have some sort of coating on them to give them a better shine. I put them in place, not bothering to give the creature eyelids. It would want to see the world perfectly after all. When I started adding teeth, I just used the entirety of the bowl, realizing too late that there were far too many on this grinning abomination's face. Why give you lips? You are beautiful the way you are. No, I murmured, adding the last few molars to the entity. When I finished, I leaned back and eyed the abomination I had created. It stood at around 4 feet tall, squatting on cat-like legs with humanoid hands. Its whole body was covered in black fur save for the bald head. There was no nose, and it stared at me with those bloodshot eyes and an unsettling grin. You are magnificent, I murmured, nearly fainting. I created 4 of those monsters in total. Each time it would become easier, the necessary pieces just showing up as I slept. I never showed these grinning creations to anyone. They didn't need to see them. They were mine. My own creations, my own little friends to keep me company. Eventually, I lost contact with Luciano. One day he just stopped coming to the studio and eventually it closed down. The police said they suspected he was involved with the mob. And just as they were starting to close in on information that could lead to his arrest, he disappeared. I continued to create pieces, my haunting muses now guiding my hand in these dark creations. And with Luciano gone, there was no longer a middleman to pay exorbitant finder's fees to. I amassed a small fortune and retired in the late 90s. I should have been well into my 60s by the time I stopped, but I looked and felt no older than a 30-year-old man. People who slighted me, even in the slightest, would often disappear. I had been questioned by police many times in the 40 years I lived in the city, and each time nothing came of it. It wasn't until I saw them do it that I put it all together. I had invited a lover to my home, and by this time I had amassed a collection of beautiful things. I needed the beauty. It helped with the nightmares I had of these creatures. He admired many of my pieces, but as we entered the studio, I saw them sitting out, staring at us. I was horrified. No one was ever supposed to see them, and when I wasn't working, I had always put them up. What were they doing out? My God, they're hideous, he had exclaimed. Who made those monstrous things? How horrible. They're my muses, I admitted, sullenly. Muses. Those things, they're abominations. You really should burn them. I quickly escorted him from the room as he continued to berate them, shaking my head and ensuring they were really amazing. I wanted him to praise them and love them as I had, but the way he spoke of them made me feel nothing but shame. I glanced over my shoulder, and I could swear they were staring at us. We spent the night together and fell asleep in each other's arms. But when I woke, he was not with me. At first, I tacked it up to him, not wanting to disturb me and leaving in the morning. But then I wandered into the study. There, in the middle of the floor, surrounded by those things I had made, was the body of the man I had brought home. He was covered in cuts and scratches. His nose looked like it had been bitten clean off, but he was still breathing. I could just make out the shallow heaving of his ravaged chest. I shouted, horror in my voice. One of the things turned and looked at me. I felt my stomach climb in my throat as it raised a single, gnarled finger to its lipless grin. I screamed, horrified. I ran as fast as my feet could carry me out of that house, and I kept running. I couldn't go to the police. What would I tell them? My sculptures have been killing people. I'm certain that would go over wonderfully. No, I had to do something about them. I had to stop them. I must have been 3 blocks away from the house when I finally collected myself enough to go back. When I returned, I marched straight into the study, only to find the body gone and any sign of the attack gone with it. I stomped over to the cabinet I kept them in and flung it open. They were sitting there, lifeless, but still staring at me. All this time, I murmured, all this time you've been taking lives. None of the sculptures moved or acknowledged me. I collected one of them and hauled it into the backyard. I coated the thing in lighter fluid from the charcoal grill and set fire to it. I stared at the thing as it burned, yet it continued to do nothing, like it was mocking me. So I burned the rest of them that same night. None of them ever reacted to my actions, pretending that I didn't see what I had seen that morning. When the last of them was a charred pile of ashes, I breathed a sigh of relief. I was free, That night, my dreams were filled with those creatures. Visions of them slaughtering countless people and just wandering back into the cupboard at night and pretending like they did nothing. I couldn't get the sight of the one who silenced me out of my head. I was awakened by a crash in my study. I shot up and looked at my door. Had someone broken in? Slowly, I pulled myself out of bed and grabbed the bat I kept nearby for such occasions. Quietly, I crept, not wanting to startle the intruder, but when I arrived in the study, there was no man to be found. I searched the room and found nothing, until I glanced upon the canvas that I had set out. Upon it, written in ash, were the words, "It's not that easy." My stomach sank, and I turned to face the cabinet. Slowly, I opened those cupboard doors, and to my horror, there they Saturday. Those freakish little monsters with their lidless, bulging eyes and too many toothed grins stared at me. Whatever beauty I had seen in these monsters had vanished the moment I discovered their purpose. The darkness I had poured into them. "So you are my curse," I murmured, shaking my head. "Fine, then I will bear you, but you will never harm another, not so long as I can do something about it." I don't know why I resolved to simply let them be, but if burning them down to nothing wouldn't destroy them, then I had a feeling nothing truly would. For over a year, I tried to figure out a way to stop these things, to control them, but nothing seemed to work. I sealed them in glass cases, locked cabinets, and even tried to bury them. They simply kept coming back. Eventually, I built a room in my basement, a sort of twisted display case that I kept them locked away in. Their bulging gaze always haunted me. Every time I journeyed down there, I could feel them watching me, a malice building in their stares, so I wrapped their eyes in gauze. I sealed them in a room all their own and blinded them, and it seemed to work. For 10 long years, I didn't feel their hate. For 10 years, I left them in the dark and alone, and in those 10 years, I began to feel the first onset of aging, as if whatever twisted gift they had given me was finally beginning to fade. I never left home. I became a sort of recluse trying to keep these monsters at bay. I boarded the basement door, chained it, and placed a heavy shelf in front of it in an attempt to seal the prison for these grinning bastards. I spent 10 years having my groceries delivered to my front door, and I had amassed a small fortune so I didn't need to work. My only connection to the outside world was the television and the computer. Those were the loneliest 10 years of my life. I needed someone. I no longer sought love, but instead I wanted someone to speak to, just an ear to listen and an eye to admire the vast treasures I had collected. So I put out a job offer on one of those gig apps. One young man accepted, Alan. He was a kind boy, and he helped me keep my home clean. In return, I paid well. It was nice to have someone present again. During one of his cleanings, he had moved the shelf I had used to hide the basement door, and he inquired about it. Why would I board up and chain this door, then place such a heavy shelf in front of it? When he inquired, I felt that malice again. This time it nearly overwhelmed me. They had simply been waiting, as if they knew they'd be let loose. I urged him to let it go, that nothing good existed down there, only the past and dark memories. He seemed to understand and accept my plea. He even helped me push the shelf back into place. I thought that was the end of it. Even the hatred coming from down below began to fade again. I wish that was where the story concluded, that Alan hadn't done what he did, but he was a young man and curiosity is hard to escape. My time with Alan helped me to realize that life was too short to spend it trying to just be a jailer to these monsters. I had to get out again, to journey into the public eye and spend time amongst the people. I spent the day shopping and even purchased a new car. Then I chose to go to a nearby gallery opening. I had a wonderful time, and the people there truly had a passion for the artistic. I had even met another man who I had promised I'd see again. Things were going the right way, finally. Then I came home. When I entered, I was overcome by the wave of hate that permeated throughout my home. And I soon saw why. The basement had been unsealed, the chains broken, the boards torn away, and the shelf moved. I rushed down the stairs and found Alan staring at them. He had removed the gauze from their eyes, and there was nothing but curiosity in his gaze. but it soon turned to regret and guilt as he saw me. "Oh, Mr. Allard, I'm so sorry. I only shook my head and offered a calm smile. "I understand. My boy, were I your age, my curiosity likely would have gotten the better of me, too. These things," I murmured, turning to face them. "These grinners, they are a memory I wish to forget." So I sealed them away. I could feel their hateful gaze on me, but I continued to speak as though they were just pieces of art. "You should leave. Alan." I glanced at him as he grabbed his collection of tools and ran back up the stairs. My eyes drifted back to the fiends I had made. "I can't escape you, can I? It's not that easy." I smiled grimly and turned to leave. I knew their eyes were still on me, and it no longer mattered. That night, I was awakened by a soft tapping at my window. It was strange. I slept on the second story of my house, and there were no trees outside. So when I went to the window, I half expected the man I had met at the gallery tossing pebbles to wake me. Call it hopeless romanticism, or just pure naivety. But when all you have for 10 years are stories to read and watch, you begin to fantasize about those sorts of things. I tossed my curtains to the side and nearly fell backward. There, clinging to the glass and lightly tapping against it, was one of those grinners. When we locked eyes, it raised a single clawed finger to its lipless mouth as it had done so long ago. This time, though, it breathed onto my window and scratched a single word into the fog. "Alan." My eyes widened. I rushed over to my phone and called him immediately. It was the middle of the night. I don't know what I expected. "Hello?" came the bleary answer, sleep still clinging to the voice as it desperately tried to pull him back down. "Alan, please listen to me. They are coming for you. You need to leave, to run. Do not stop until you are far from here." "Mr. Allard, what are you?" There was a crash from somewhere on his side of the line. "Hello?" I heard him call through the receiver. I didn't know if I was too late, but then I turned to look at the window again. The grinning fiend was still there, but the fogged word had changed. "You." I wasted no time. I gathered a few things and ran from that house. I ran to my new car. I drove for what must have been hours. I must have tried to get a hold of Alan at least 10 times during that drive, but there was never an answer. I don't know if they managed to take him, but I know they're coming for me. Every night since that fateful evening, I've heard a soft tapping at whatever window or door is nearby. I know they're just playing with me. I know they're waiting for the right chance, but that's not my worry anymore. I know that someday soon they will take me. But then what? They've been my charge for over half a century. Will they find someone new? Or are they simply free to do as they please now? Whatever the case, I am sorry. I woke in the middle of the night to find my boyfriend sitting on the end of our bed, staring into the dark corner of our bedroom. I called out to him groggily, "Jack." He didn't respond. "Jack." I called again. He was still and completely silent. I moved to the end of the bed and looked at him. The look on his face froze my blood. It's as though he wasn't there. His eyes were wide open. His pupils were like dinner plates as he stared endlessly at the dark corner of our room. Needless to say, nothing like this had happened before. Jack wasn't a sleepwalker. He usually slept through the night just fine. No tossing or turning or even grinding his teeth. He was gripping his knees with both hands. I reached out and gently put my hand on his. I swept his brown hair out of his eyes and softly said, "Jack, let's go back to bed." I wasn't trying to wake him. They say you're not supposed to wake a sleepwalker. I was trying to guide him back under the covers, but suddenly he snapped out of it, and the life came back into his eyes, and he looked me. "Haley." He was clearly confused. "I woke up and found you sitting here on the end of the bed. You looked completely out of it," I said. "Damn. Really? That's creepy." He blinked a lot and looked around the room. "Let's go back to bed," I said. And we did. We got up a couple hours later. Around 5 a.m., Jack was working crazy hours. He would go in at 6 and work 12 to 16 hours before dragging himself back home. We assumed that was the reason for his strange behavior, so we made a plan to get to bed earlier. He got home around 9 p.m. and went immediately to bed. I joined him a couple hours later. I slid under the covers. He turned over and put his arm around me, and I was out. I woke up with a start this time. Again, Jack was sitting on the end of the bed, staring into the corner. "Jack," I hissed at him. I'll admit that this time I was not in the mood. It's selfish, I know, but I just wanted to sleep. I managed to pull myself out of bed. I Saturday down next to him. Again, his eyes were fixed on the dark, far corner of our bedroom. I grabbed his knee and gently shook it. "Jack, we have to go back to..." Then Jack said something. It sounded like swan. I leaned in close to him, fully awake now and chills going up my arm. "What did you say?" "Jack." Swan. I was ready to give up and pull him back to bed rather than sit up and try to translate gibberish, but then he raised his hand. He extended his index finger and pointed into the dark corner, and he whispered, "He's watching us." A shock of fear ran through my body like lightning. I slowly turned from Jack to the corner where he pointed. I stared into the darkness but saw nothing. What did I expect to see then? A ghost. Then I jumped up and moved to the side of the bed and snapped on the lamp on the side table. I looked over at the corner of the room one more time to be sure. There was nothing there. Did it happen again? Jack was looking at me, blinking his eyes rapidly with a kind of anguish on his face. I remember it this time. I sat next to him on the bed. I could see the bedroom, but I couldn't move. "Sleep paralysis," I said. He nodded. It was as if something was forcing me to stare into the corner. I was just staring into the darkness until I began to see something emerge from the wall. He looked terrified. "It was a nightmare," I said. I rubbed his back and kissed him. "It felt like I was conjuring something," he added. "A nightmare," I repeated. "Let's go back to bed." Beep, beep, beep. It was Jack's alarm on his phone. It was 5 a.m. and time for him to get ready to go to work, even on a Saturday. "Fuck," Jack groaned. "I'll start the coffee," I said as I made my way down the hall. I decided not to tell Jack what he was saying in the night. He's watching us. It was probably nothing anyway, just a nightmare. I handed Jack his travel mug of black coffee, gave him a kiss, and watched him step out the door into the still, dark morning. I had the day off from work. After some coffee and reading, it was time to get the house in order. I started in the bedroom. I was making the bed when I got a feeling I couldn't shake. It felt like I was being watched. I looked over at the corner of the room and almost screamed. On the corner walls of the room was what looked like the silhouette of a man. It was an outline of a full body. There was clearly a head, shoulders and torso cast onto the corner of the room. I watched the figure for a second, and something seemed off about it, apart from the obvious strangeness of its presence in general. The figure did not seem like a shadow, but more like an image imprinted on the wall. I slowly walked over to the corner and placed my hand on the wall. I don't know why. When I pulled my hand away, it was covered in a dark dust. I looked closely at the dark image. Then I wiped my rag across it. The dust came away onto the rag and powdered into the air. It looked like ash. I wet the rag and wiped the rest of the shadow figure it off the wall. I know what you're thinking. Why didn't you just leave the fucking house? The short answer is, we did. I spent that whole day alone in the house. I spent that whole day thinking about those words that Jack had said in the night. He's watching us. Then I spent the whole day thinking about that ashen shadow figure on the wall. Then I booked us a hotel room. Jack arrived home at about 9 p.m. and I already had everything packed. "What's going on?" Jack asked. "I got us a room at the Skyview for the night." He dropped his backpack on the floor. "Did something happen?" "I just thought a change of scenery might help you sleep through the night." I don't know, I'm pretty tired already. I was already rolling the suitcase out the front door. The room is already booked and paid for. I'll drive. I called back to him. I didn't tell him that in the suitcase was a new set of lingerie and heels I had ordered a few days ago. I woke up hours later in a king-sized hotel bed, now wearing nothing but sheer nylon thigh highs. The TV was still on and flickering in the corner of the room. Through my bleary vision, I could see the digital clock on the side table, which read 3 a.m. I shot up and reached over to the other side of the bed. I felt Jack's chest. Thank God. I settled into him and closed my eyes. Then I felt Jack's head turn toward me. He made a sound. "What?" I whispered. What I heard next made my blood run cold. "He's watching us." I shot up and looked around the room, and then I saw it. The TV in the corner was now showing nothing but static. Somehow something about it looked off, as if the little static particles were behaving in coordinated patterns of movement. Then I saw it. Within the static, I could see the dark figure of a head and shoulders. It looked just like the shadow figure that appeared in our bedroom. I could barely make out any features, but from the outline of the figure, I could tell it was smiling. He was watching us and he was smiling. "Jack, wake up." Jack didn't move. I kept my eyes locked on the shadowy thing on the TV screen. "Jack, wake up." I shouted this time and shook his arm. Jack, he didn't even stir. I remembered the TV remote was on the side table.
I slowly reached over, keep my eyes on the man in the static all the while.
I felt the remote with the tip of my fingers. I gripped it and quickly mashed the power button. The screen went dark and so did my vision. My eyes flicked around the pitch-black darkness. My vision adjusted and all I saw was the shadowy hotel room. I turned to wake Jack and my heart nearly stopped. Jack wasn't there. He wasn't in the bed. Then I saw him. Jack was standing in front of the TV in corner of the room. Even in the near-complete darkness, I could see his unblinking, bloodshot eyes staring right at me. A dead smile was plastered on his face. "Jack, Jack, wake up," I squeaked. He slowly moved across the room. It looked as though his body wasn't working correctly. He moved like a marionette, twitching and lurching across the room towards me. I looked around for some form of weapon. I chose the telephone on the side table. I pulled the cord from the receiver and held it up like a club. "Don't come any closer, Jack." His rigor mortis smile continued its slow movement towards me in the darkness. Suddenly, he was only 2 steps away. I stepped forward and swung the phone, connecting hard with the side of his head. I know that the thing I just hit with the phone was not Jack. Not really, but I could feel that my Jack was still in there somewhere. Jack was the love of my life. When I hit him, I couldn't help feeling regret. After I hit him, I hesitated. Not for long, but long enough for him to turn back towards me and reach a hand for my throat. I backed away at the last second and bolted for the door. It was too late. He caught me by the arm. The last thing I remember was my scream being choked out by a hand gripping my throat and squeezing hard. I woke up in our bedroom. I was on my knees, bound with duct tape around my ankles, wrists and mouth. In front of me was Jack. He was kneeling facing the dark corner of our bedroom. His head was flung back and he was rapidly whispering something. It looked as though he was in prayer or some kind of religious fervor. Then I saw it. The dark shadows in the corner of the bedroom seemed to darken even more. A shape emerged, a head, then shoulders and arms. At first the shape appeared as a silhouette, then it seemed to emerge from the wall and take solid form. A face was coming through our bedroom wall, and it was darker than dark and smiling a horrible smile, the same smile I saw plastered across Jack's face. Jack's whispering became more urgent. He spread his arms out to either side. The dark thing opened its eyes. They were pitch black. Its arms emerged from the wall. They were long, and its hands extended out into narrow, endless fingers. It reached out and put its hands around Jack's throat. I tried again to scream. The thing's hands moved up and gripped Jack's head, then with one quick motion snapped his head around completely. I'll never forget the look on Jack's face. He was smiling. I screamed and cried. The dark thing pulled Jack into the corner of the room and somehow pulled him through the wall. Jack's body was gone, and I was left alone in the bedroom screaming through the duct tape on my mouth. I toppled onto my side and screamed until my voice box shattered, and then I kept screaming. I slammed my knees into the ground, making as much noise as possible. I don't know how long it was before the police showed up. They asked me what happened. I couldn't speak after screaming for hours, so I had to write it all down on one of their notepads. I told them what I am now telling you.
They didn't say as much, but they clearly didn't believe me.
Jack's fingerprints were on the duct tape that I was bound with, and technically, he is the one that did that attack and restrained me. My claim that he was under some kind of supernatural possession to them just read as a defense mechanism against the domestic abuse that they believed I had suffered. Every so often, an officer checks in with me to see if I know where Jack is, or if I've heard from him. They believe he's on the lam somewhere. I'm living with my family now. I sleep with all the lights on if I'm lucky enough to sleep at all. Lately, there's been power outages in the neighborhood. They didn't start until I started living with them. I don't know why that thing took Jack and didn't take me. I can only assume that one of these nights it will come back. One of the dumbest things I did in my youth during my urban exploration phase was to agree to check out some abandoned places for some sketchy people to hold a rave. I was never into the whole electronic music scene, nor was I interested in taking shit like ecstasy for a good time, but he gave me $500 up front and a couple places on a map. The only condition was I keep my mouth shut and there'd be an additional $500 when I brought back my scouting report. I don't know, that sketchy quite paints the real picture of Dave, the guy in charge who was paying me. He was one of those Hollywood kids whose parents barely played a role in his life growing up, except to blame him when a role went to someone else. A guy who was convinced he was the main character in the story, when in fact he was barely an afterthought to anyone who wasn't buying drugs from him. These were the days before people filmed their trespassing for followers and likes. You were more likely to get your ass shot off with rock salt or worse. Recording your own evidence against yourself for YouTube was ages away. It took a few days of thinking about it before I agreed to take the job. $1,000 was a lot of money to me, and at the time, and honestly, if I had known the locations, I'd have probably already visited them on my own dime. The two locations were in drastically different areas in California. One was an abandoned warehouse that was well known to everyone except apparently Dave. It had a history of squatters, gang activity, more than a couple murders and a fire during wait for it, a rave that took out the roof and forced the place to finally be condemned. I did make sure to double-check the location to verify it was not an option, and even verified with Dave that he hadn't given me the wrong address. Man, it's all good. Look, the place up north is better anyway. All sorts of trees to block the noise so we don't get any legal interference. We can hit Humboldt on the way for buds and shit. I know that place is up there. I just need you to make sure it's still there, Dave said over the phone. To say the other place was way up north was an understatement, as this place was easily an 11+ hour drive from Hollywood almost all the way up to Oregon, mostly on the 5, but a good way onto the 101 as well. Then a few other roads, and Jesus, this was becoming not worth $1,000 to me. I couldn't even imagine how he was going to get a bunch of rave kids up there. Not my problem, not what I was being paid to do. The town itself was called Hewing or Hewwood. Dave wasn't sure, but the directions were very detailed, and he seemed to know it was a real place. My mom filmed some movie up there when I was really young. She was fucking the director or some shit. That's the only reason she got the job. About the same time Dad was filming commercials in Japan. I've been there a couple times since then. An old lumber town that went out of business because of an owl or something. I think some circus had a fire. I don't know, but it's out of the way. No one has a reason to go there. The bright side of all of this was it wasn't just a single building out in the woods. It was apparently a sizable ghost town. Even if nothing was standing there, would still be something to find. And then Dave and his group of junkheads could decide if it was worth dragging the generators needed for it, or if anyone would even show. Not my problem though. I still wasn't looking forward to 11 hours of driving, and things like hotels and gas were going to take a big bite out of the first $500. But I was really focused on exploring abandoned places, and this fit the bill. My hesitation came from stories I had heard of places like Murder Mountain up in that area. Places where growers would protect their weed at any cost. People were known to disappear up there and never be found. This place on Dave's map seemed remote enough that I thought to myself, this may end up being an extremely bad idea. I should have listened to my stomach. Instead, I got into my Toyota 4 multiplied by 4. The absolute worst part of the drive, outside of watching my $500 quickly dwindling thanks to overprices gas stations out in the middle of bumfuck Egypt, was easily the radio. Once past Sonoma, once you were really in true Northern California, all the radio stations were either new age crystal bullshit or radio interviews with people like Margaret, the lady who was having intimate relations with a Bigfoot. Yeah, as entertaining as that sounds, it lost its charm after hearing her talk about her yearning for it to continue and her almost juvenile level terminologies for sexual intercourse. The trees really were the only thing that kept my interest piqued during most of the drive. Those redwoods, those amazing giant trees standing there for thousands of years. I pulled over a couple times to take a piss on the side of the road. Traffic was almost non-existent, so I took my time during those breaks to walk around a bit and breathe in the air. Growing up near Hollywood, you always got the smog from all the traffic. Where I lived off the 405, it was unhealthy at best. There were people I knew growing up who had no idea that there were hills nearby because they had never seen them through the smog. Calling this place a breath of fresh air was not only accurate, but somehow barely described it. It was refreshing and relaxing, but daylight was fading, and there were still a good couple hours before I made it to the little no-name hotel I had booked a room with. If worse came to worst, I knew of a place in Humboldt. Either way, it meant getting back in the truck. The rest of the drive went smoothly, albeit I now know far more rhetoric about the vibrational energy-based system of healing with crystals than I'll ever have a use to know. The motel I stayed at was about what you'd expect for $19 a night. Cinder block walls and poured concrete floors, a dual AC heater protruding from the wall next to the door. It had the essence of a giant oven. With its sparse accommodations, you could tell at one point the floor had a proper carpet, but now just had a couple large rugs thrown down on either side of the bed. The toilet looked like it had sunk with the Titanic and was brought up from the depths and placed into this room. Nasty is an understatement. The bed had either been broken or was pieced together using an incomplete frame. The mattress itself had no box spring, just a pallet nailed to the sideboards that it laid upon. This was to be some real high society living. Worse even than that, the town had closed up for the night around 5 p.m. It was now almost midnight and I was starving. Thankfully, the one thing the hotel did have was a vending machine with a number of treats that looked like they went back to the Carter administration. I was too hungry to care. I carried my spoils back to the room, ate and passed out. With the vast wilderness literally surrounding me everywhere, I decided that on the way back home, I'd just simply sleep in the back of my truck. The camper shell would give me enough privacy, and the pile of moving blankets would keep me plenty warm. Far less sketchy than spending another nice day at this place. The next morning, I got up early enough to grab a free cup of coffee and a banana before checking out and driving the next few hours to my destination. The coffee was barely dark enough to call coffee, and the banana had something wiggling in it, so I decided to just stop at a roadside diner and cut my losses. Finally back on the road, it took only another hour to find the first of several roads that cut off from the main highway. It was slow going for much of it, but when I had finally come up on the final road, I started to get excited. It was overgrown. It was obvious no one came up this way often. I had a sudden fear that it would be very obvious that a vehicle had passed through here, and hoped that my 4 multiplied by 4 was high enough that it would knock down the minimal brush and weeds. I had mixed fears regarding possible unfriendly growers, hoping that all the growth here meant no one kept an eye on the area. With caution, I slowly made my way down the road. The further I ventured down it, the more obvious that this place hadn't been visited in years. It was a bit of a relief, I have to admit. I figured at the time that if it was this overgrown, then I could just camp here tonight, as no one would be the wiser. I really wish I hadn't. The road came to a rather abrupt end where a large security gate stood. It had obviously been painted yellow when it was installed, but the paint was almost all chipped away. Beyond the gates, the road did continue on to what was to be the first of several buildings. I backed up and found a small clearing off the side of the road, obscured from it by trees and overgrowth. My confidence had greatly improved at this point, and I had no doubt that I had this place to myself to explore for as long as I decided to stay. I grabbed my backpack, which among other things had my flashlight with a fresh set of 4 D-cell batteries in it, a small toolkit for getting into wherever I needed to get into, and a .22 caliber revolver. The gun wasn't much, but if there were some bums squatting in here, at least I'd have something to protect myself with. The first building was a gas station, the remains of one really. You could tell where the pumps had been. Most of the structure was burned out and caved in. The best part of it though, over to the side were the lower remains of one of those muffler man statues. The top half looked as though it was pulled down by force, with a chain still tightly wrapped around its neck. Made me wonder for a moment, what happened first? The statue or the fire? Vandalism? I didn't want to waste too much daylight on it. It was one of those things that was at the heart of my need to explore. But I had what was left of my money to earn, and I knew from experience that daylight is a precious commodity. Next up was a surprise to me. It was a pair of old cars just sitting off to the side in the trees. I couldn't tell who the maker was. Neither had more than the cab and pieces and parts of the engine block. The rusted patina made these both look spooky and amazing all at once. I was happy to see there wasn't any graffiti on either of them. They were just left and forgotten. The road continued up for a ways and began to turn towards the left. I could see from the distance that there was finally something looking like sidewalks, but the area had already long ago begun to reclaim the area, and it dawned on me I should be conscious of snakes and ticks. It was then that I got the first smell of it, like burning burlap. There was no smoke in the air and the smell seemed old. I'm not sure how to clearly explain it. Like I was smelling an antique blanket that had been in a place that burned down. I couldn't see anything. I started to assume it was from the gas station, but that area didn't have any smell of note. I continued on my way. Around the bend, I was almost in a state of shock. There were the remnants of a main street, small buildings, many that were completely dilapidated, and others that looked as if you could open them for business with little work at all. Nothing that looked burnt, though, and the smell was growing stronger as I made my way further in. The houses that were still standing looked as if a stampede had run through them. Doors not just opened, but completely busted outward. Some of the remnants of doors out past the yard and onto the sidewalk. I suddenly had a scary thought. Bigfoot. You just keep your sexy time to Margaret there. Bigfoot, I said out loud in no particular direction. She's your type. I am certainly not. The sheer absurdity made me laugh, until I realized I said that out loud, and now if anyone was here and heard it, I could have a problem. I pushed on past the houses to an interesting intersection, one where on one side was the obvious schoolhouse, and on the opposite side, a beautiful church, both in greatly better condition than anything else in the town so far. A little past these, I could see what looked to be what was probably the center of town. I could see a gazebo in what looked to be a park. I decided that I could wait. The church just looked too amazing to pass up. That ever-present smell of smoke seemed to lighten as I got closer to the church. The doors were all intact, which, considering everything else, had surprised me a bit. Also again made me cautious. I began to wonder why and how this building and the schoolhouse seemingly had avoided being vandalized like the house and everything else so far in town. I decided to break out some of my tools and see if I could force the lock. As luck would have it, it didn't take much effort at all. The door itself had rotted around the deadbolt, and I pretty much just pushed it out of position, opened the door and walked in. As soon as I walked in, the sound around me changed. It was as if I had cupped my ears with my hands. Sound seemed like it was coming from a tunnel or cave. I held my nose and tried to make my ears pop. Made it worse. My equilibrium started to go haywire. I both felt like I was floating as well as tipping over. My vision started to clip from left to right, though my eyes were not moving. I began to vomit uncontrollably. And when it stopped, I moved over to a church pew and Saturday down, leaning forward with my head towards my lap. My arms were up and over my head as if to block it from some invisible blow. Without realizing it, I must have passed out. I was still sitting in the pew, but I could see through the gap in the door that it was night out. With me being as disoriented as I was, I never thought to question why the inside of the church seemed to be lit up. There were no obvious lights in the structure that I could see, but everything was bright as day inside. I got up to look out the door to see what I could. Other lights and so on. There was a new smell, that of popcorn. "Are you leaving?" a young female voice asked. "What the fuck? Who's there?" I said, halfway shitting my pants. I'd been sitting there prone for who knows how long, and now there's a voice. Was the only response. Still a bit disoriented, I looked around the small church as much as I could. All the while the sound continued, distant, but right on top of me. "I'm sorry," I screamed. "You just startled me," I said, trying to assure the person that they didn't need to fear me. I was certainly feeling fear of them in the moment. "Did you come for the show?" she asked. Her voice seemingly came from everywhere in every direction, but somehow really close. The hair on my arms began standing up. I remember that every ounce of energy I had, I was about to use bolting for the door out. Even visualized it. But I was back in the pew. My getting up to look out the door felt like I had only dreamed it. But now I knew I was awake. I tried to get out, and once more I visualized getting up and heading towards the door. But again I was back in the pew. "People don't come to the church anymore, not since the circus." Her voice had a sadness to it, but it felt misleading. There was certainly an air to her voice that had the sentiment of a spider toying with its food. "Who are you? Do you live here?" I asked, not really knowing what else to do. It was quite apparent my mind and my body were not in sync with each other enough to make it out that door. "They call me Piggy," she said in a voice that was now far more wispy in its tone. "That doesn't sound very nice of them," I said. Was I dealing with some overweight runaway, one smart enough to maybe have drugged me somehow? I only heard what sounded like a deep breath being taken in, but never exhaled. "I'm sorry if I'm bothering you. I was sent here to see the town." "And the circus?" she asked again with a slightly more joyful tone in the way she said it. "I don't know about the circus," I said. "Why don't you tell me about it?" I could see a small, petite figure move from what had been the pulpit of the church towards the 5 or so steps leading down. It was the only place the light wasn't illuminating. She had a strange cadence to her walk. My eyes were still having difficulties focusing. When I moved my line of sight too quickly, the world would spin for a moment. She did seem to take a seat on the steps. She began her story by telling me that her and her older sister were part of the circus. My sister, she was 3 years older than me. She started with our father back when he was doing revivals. Revivals. I didn't really understand what that meant at the time, not until she continued. Dad kept getting run out of places because he'd have his revival, then he would, as Mom would say, go off whoring around. There was a slight pause, almost as if she didn't understand the words she was speaking. When Mom did it, she got pregnant with me. Dad wasn't making money at his revivals and ended up joining another group and putting together a circus with his big tent. We all traveled by big trucks. I remember I was always looked after by the clowns. How is it you are so far away from me right now, but you're so loud you're in my head? I asked. The disorientation wasn't going away. She didn't seem to notice me speaking. Dad would call me Mommy's little pig baby. Some of the clowns just took to calling me Piggy. Clowns were nice. People were scared of them, and they should be. They can be. She trailed off. I remember this moment of clarity, where all I could think to do was run towards the door, but I had been so turned around by my disorientation that the direction I ran took me closer to the girl. She looked up, and I could see the young face, teenager at best, but tiny. She spoke like an older girl, but she was so small. The disorientation came back and I was forced to sit down. I remember trying to focus on her, but it was like there was a shadow in my way. We came here in the summer. The town was small, and they seemed to appreciate that we made our way up to stop here. We performed for 2 nights with the people of the town showing up for both shows. Someone caught my sister's eye. She was like Mom in that. There was always a boy in town that caught her eye. Dad had to take her to a special doctor we weren't allowed to talk about once because of it. The one he wanted to take Piggy to before I was born. I was horrified, but it was about to get so much worse. On the final nights, I was told to stay out of the way as everyone had to break down the tents. But something happened. No one took down the tents. I stayed with my sister, who continued to try and get me to stay behind. I pretended like I was obeying, but followed from a distance. She met up with the boy, and several other boys followed them out to the woods. I followed as close as I could without being seen, but when I started to hear the screams, I ran to where my sister was. The boys had started to stab her repeatedly, and then as I started to scream, they came at me. They dragged me off and carried my sister along as well. I heard boys talking about how bad it was and blaming each other. Then came that low, murmuring sound again. The next thing I remember, it was as if my disorientation was drained from my feet. I could actually feel all of it from the top of my head down to my feet, like a rush of sobriety. Now with clarity back, a new fear emerged. It wasn't my disorientation that was forcing me to sit almost paralyzed. It was something else entirely. I looked over at the girl. Her head was slightly tilted forward. Her short dress was red to match her hair. The white ruffled piece around her neck looks dirty, and there was something else about it I couldn't quite figure out. The shadows still played tricks on my eyes. They all but dragged us to a farm not too far out of the way. They tossed my sister over a wooden fence, and I could hear the sound of them, the hogs, rushing to my sister, her screams as they began to bite and chew on her. I was speechless. The things that this girl had to witness. I tried to muster up the words to say, "I'm sorry for what happened," but my jaw felt locked in position. One boy, the one who was really angry that I interrupted them, grabbed me and swung me over the fence as well. He didn't drop me, just let my legs dangle. My eyes went wide. Those shadows that had been obscuring my vision had dissipated, and I could see all. The steps she was sitting on were covered in thick, glossy, almost congealed blood. Her right leg was a red boot that matched her clown-like costume. Her left leg, what was left of it, was shredded and bloodied below the knee. Her left hand was disfigured but looked to be intact. In her right hand, she seemed to be holding someone else's hand, maybe a doll, with the rest of it hidden behind her. She looked at me with eyes that seemed to glow in a ghostly white, face covered in blood. I couldn't tell if the skin was pale or if that was clown makeup she was wearing, but when she looked at me, I felt as if I was done. She was in control, and I was hers to do with what she would. I heard the clowns. They called for their piggy. The boy dropped me and I screamed, which brought them to us. One quickly grabbed me away from a hog that had begun to drag me by the hand, and another who had my leg. As he did, I grabbed for my sister's hand as he pulled me out. The boys scattered, heading back to town. The clowns followed. I kept holding my sister's hand. I had tears in my eyes at this point. No idea what was to be my fate, but what had happened to this young girl was atrocious. She continued. Eventually they gathered up those boys and others into the tent. The clowns went to every house and brought everyone to the tent. The town was found guilty, and the fire burned. I haven't been to a circus since then. I miss the circus. She moved close to me. The strange cadence I saw in her walk was actually the limp from missing most of her leg. How she made it to me at all was otherworldly. "Circuses need people," she said as she ran her mangled hand across my cheek. "You sleep now, and tomorrow you go back to tell them to come." I mustered all my strength and will and was able to just ask one question to her. "But what is your real name?" They called me Piggy. I woke up in the back of my truck wrapped up in moving blankets. At the time, I couldn't remember the girl or her story. It was like the entire memory had been surgically removed, leaving only images in my mind. A giant tent at the center of town. The only thought I had as I drove back was that it would be perfect for Dave's rave. I drove back down to Southern California, back to Hollywood where I met up with Dave. I gave him all the details I could remember, everything about how a giant tent would be perfect there. So much room. The bigger the tent, the better. He paid me my $500 and thanked me. It was months later that I had heard the news. Dave had held his rave with an estimated 150 or so people. They can only estimate because during the rave a fire broke out, and it is assumed many of the participants escaped and did not come forward after the incident. The remains that were found were so charred from the intense heat of the fire that most were unidentifiable. The ensuing fires destroyed all the parked cars, leaving not much more than plastic and metal puddles. Those same fires ravaged what was left of the buildings in town, save for a small church that survived and a small house further in the woods with a large pen behind it. From what was reported, the only person to make it out of the fire's path was Dave. He had survived the fires but had been partially eaten by what can only be assumed to be hogs, though no hogs or any other animals were found in the area, and no damage to the pen suggesting something escaped from it. It appeared that he had been alive when the animals began to eat him. His positioning suggested that he was in a defensive posture during the experience. They could find no sign that there had been anyone living in the house, nor signs of hogs having been there in decades. Just another fact that seemed to get skimmed over in light of the greater tragedy and loss of life. It was after reading about the incident that all the memories flooded back of the girl. What had happened to her? I don't understand any of it. I spent a good amount of time looking up whatever information I could. Beyond the fire at the rave and what happened to Dave, there was nothing. Nothing of previous fires on record or information about a circus. Stranger still, all reports of the fire that killed Dave and the others lacked a single detail about location. No photos, no eyewitness accounts, no survivors. Just a few short blurbs in the local papers and obituaries. I tried to find out what movie his mother had filmed up there, but no such film exists, or at least was ever released. There was no modern record of any town called Hewing or Hewood ever existing, or of the girl they called Piggy. I found the crate waiting for me by the gate when I arrived at work. Last year, before the layoffs started, we had about 36 people working at the facility. There used to be a whole department tasked with collecting seeds and samples and communicating with other researchers across the world. Had anyone from that team still been around, they would have handled the crate. But they weren't. The acquisition team was the first one to go when our funding started to get trimmed. Soon enough, the other departments ended up getting weeded out as well. The crate had no shipping information or instructions attached. Only a hastily scrawled address of the research facility written in black marker that suggested the crate had reached its destination. The box was difficult to get my arms wrapped around, yet it was surprisingly light. Unsure of whether I was going against protocol, I carried the crate inside. It was my first week working at the facility alone. There were gardeners who would come in twice a week to take care of the manual aspects of running a botanical garden, but even they were unsure of how long their employment would last. When we'd bump into each other in the atrium, they would ask about their contracts. As with most questions, I would defer to Dr. Moss. Even before the layoffs, he was the most senior member of staff. Whatever explanation he provided to the gardeners seemed to ease their minds. He was good at keeping people calm. He was good at a lot of things. Before I opened the crate, I thought of calling Dr. Moss. He had been let go just a week prior and kindly offered me his personal number in case I ever came across something I had trouble with. A mysterious crate arriving at the facility seemed well within the scope of his offer, but I didn't call. I had already called him thrice over the past week concerning questions that I probably would have found the answers to on my own if I had thought a bit harder. I didn't want to make my constant pleas for help a habit, and the old man deserved a calm retirement. Once I had my morning coffee, I pried open the mysterious crate. The smell was the first thing that hit me. I'd been working with preserved samples for long enough to make the stench of formaldehyde or ethanol unnoticeable, but what was inside of that box didn't smell of chemicals at all. It smelled of old sweat. The contents of the crate were even more perplexing. At first, I thought it was only a collection of shrubbery and flowers, but on closer inspection I found the plants to be embedded in a blob of porous grey flesh. The plants stemming from the strange mass proved to be even more confusing. I am unqualified for most of the tasks that the layoffs have brought me, but identifying plants has always been my strong suit. Yet, even with years of education and practice, I couldn't recognize a single one of the flowers before me. I checked the crate once more for any clues about the nature of its contents. I hadn't missed anything on my first gander, but I did find an imprint on the underside of the section of crate I pried away. The logo was old and worn, yet I could make out a snake wrapped around a star with an apple in its mouth. Beneath the star there were some Cyrillic letters, but even with the help of my phone I couldn't make sense of them. Briefly, I again considered calling Dr. Moss. The man had spent over 30 years working in the facility and dedicated his entire life to botany. If there was anyone around who could make sense of the crate or its contents, it was him. I even pulled up his name on my contacts, but at the last second, I decided against calling. Dr. Moss and I were the last researchers left in the facility. Had it not been for his age, my contract would have been terminated before his. I had spent a measly 5 years at the botanical garden and knew nothing compared to his lifelong experience. He, however, was pushing 80, and the people in charge of the budget thought him a liability. Once I finished off my coffee, I plucked one of the strange flowers out of the crate and made my way to the herbarium. As remote and underfunded as our facility was, our library of specimens was immense. I was sure that I would find answers in the library of plants. Yet, even after an hour of searching, I found nothing that resembled the flower. The silver-green petals, the strange long stem, the peculiar sweaty smell of the flower. The longer I dug through the library, the more certain I was that the plant wasn't the product of natural biology. I had almost given up on the whole affair. Yet just as I was about to leave the herbarium, I remembered Dr. Moss's private collection. When he was let go, Dr. Moss told me I could have full access to his collection and notes. The injustice of his firing had kept me away from his work. Yet as I stood there with the strange flower in my hand, I bit past my discomfort. Dr. Moss's private sheets held no hint of organization. Yet by sheer luck, I found an identical flower within a couple minutes of my search. There were no labels or details about where the specimen had come from. There was only a single handwritten note pressed into the plastic. Specimen from Professor Kamer, 10, Yonar, 87. The note didn't get me any closer to understanding what the flower was, or from where the crate came from, yet those questions quickly fled my mind. Stashed in among Dr. Moss's collection, I found something that wasn't a plant. I found a photograph. It was a group shot of the research team from sunnier days, taken during one of our annual barbecues in the atrium. At first, I thought the photograph must have been taken before I started working at the facility, yet on closer inspection I found myself 5 years younger, straight out of university. Grinning like the good times would never pass, I found myself in the photograph. I picked up my phone and called him. The question of the flower and the mysterious crate was still lingering somewhere in the back of my mind. But it was the photograph which made me take out the phone. I found myself thinking less of Dr. Moss as a mentor, and more as a retired old man who might appreciate the company. When I called, Dr. Moss was in his usual good spirits. When I mentioned the photograph, he laughed and started recollecting the barbecue as if it happened the day prior. As old as the man was, his memory was pristine. For a while, we chatted about retirement and management and how the facility was sure to close down soon enough anyway. It was only in passing that I mentioned the crate and its strange contents. Dr. Moss didn't seem to make anything of my morning. Yet when I mentioned Professor Kamer, his voice turned cold. Professor Kamer? He asked, all his good cheer disappearing. Yeah. I found his name next to a sample in... Where is the crate now? In the lab. Why? There was rustling on the other side of the line. I was still no wiser on the situation of the mysterious crate, but something in the depths of my stomach told me something was wrong. Maria, listen closely. Dr. Moss's words were punctuated by the slamming of a car door. You need to grab that crate, put the lid back on, and then carry it to the incinerator. I'll be with you shortly. I didn't even know our facility had an incinerator, yet that was not my concern at the moment. The stress in Dr. Moss's voice made me beyond uneasy. Do you know what was in that crate? I asked as I made my way out of the herbarium towards the lab. The lack of immediate response made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Suddenly, the strange flowers and twigs I found in the box seemed irrelevant. It was the spongy flesh in which they were embedded that bothered me the most. Yes, said the voice from the phone. The crate came from the United People's Institute of... A hush of static ate away at his response. The phone reception in the hills leading up to the facility has always left a lot to be desired. Working in a remote place, one gets used to it. I didn't think it would ever bother me. As I entered the lab, however, the lack of reception sent me into a full-blown panic. Hello? His voice fizzled through the phone. I think the connection dropped for a second. Can you hear me now? Yes. The lab had grown considerably colder. My teeth refused to cooperate with my mouth. Off in the distance, the thunder of an incoming storm roared. To the crate is he empty? Get out! Get out right now! That thing is dangerous. Dr. Moss barked to the backing of a straining engine. Meet me by the gate. Make sure the thing doesn't... The call dropped. I didn't attempt to revive it. I was too busy sprinting for my life. Never, in the 5 years that I had worked at the facility, had the remote nature of my work bothered me. In fact, I found it calming to be far away from the smog and noise pollution of the city. It was nice to get to divorce myself from the hustle of the regular world and focus on the things I am passionate about. The sight of the facility had always calmed me, yet as I stood by its gates that morning, the visage of the botanical garden was all but tranquil. I was alone in the hills. I was alone, and I would stay alone for at least half an hour as Dr. Moss made his drive up. I tried calling him again. A couple times the phone actually rang, but the connection was never made. It wasn't just the low coverage in the hills that was keeping me severed from the rest of the world. The storm that had been brewing all morning had finally let loose. At first, I stayed out in the rain. The promise of that grey, fleshed thing lingering somewhere in the lab made getting wet an easily acceptable discomfort. As the storm picked up, however, I started to worry about my phone. It was my one sole connection to the outside world, and the prospect of it shutting off was beyond dangerous. When the rain turned so heavy that I couldn't dry my glasses, I retreated back to the facility. The torrential downpour strengthened, and the half hour which it would take Dr. Moss to drive up to the facility came and went. I kept on trying to call him, yet the phone kept on telling me that the number was unavailable. It wasn't until the rain had died down that a dial tone emerged. He still didn't pick up. I called again, and again, and again. The roads leading up to the facility were never particularly well maintained, and the storm would have made them harder to drive still. My mind was quickly producing images of an overturned car with Dr. Moss's phone lying somewhere in the mud covered in broken glass. With the storm having died down and the promise of help steadily dwindling, I was starting to consider simply getting in my car and summoning help myself. Yet, on my 6th attempt to call Dr. Moss, I heard something beyond the dial tone. Mwah, 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 mwah. It was coming from the atrium. At first, I noticed nothing out of the ordinary. On closer inspection, however, I glimpsed something shifting by the grill that Dr. Moss used to man during our barbecues. On first glance, it looked like a gathering of lawn trimmings with some flowers and branches thrown in. Both the flowers and shrubbery denied any classification, yet the pile was motionless and seemed harmless enough. For a moment, I started to question whether I had not simply poured out the contents of the crate in the atrium and forgotten about it. Yet then, with disturbing fluidity, the pile of foliage started to shift around. Mwah, 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 mwah. As the creature squirmed, it revealed its true nature. The shrubbery shifted to reveal a sea of beady yellow eyeballs. They shifted towards the grill and regarded the can of lighter fluid with utter fascination. As if trying to speak to it, the creature spread out its fat, drooping lips in terrible vocalizations. Mwah, 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 mwah. There was something patently wrong with the creature I was looking at. I was sure of that. Yet, even past the fear and disgust, I was still a scientist. I could not deny my curiosity. I stepped to the window to get a closer look at the creature. The focus of my studies has always been with plants, but I was sure that even an expert taxonomist couldn't make sense of the mumbling madness in the atrium. The creature resembled something akin to a jellyfish, yet it seemed to take in the world through reptilian eyes. The mere existence of the beast was concerning enough, but what made the sight truly disturbing were the creature's lips. They resembled primate lips, though swollen and sickly and attached to a being wholly not of the natural world. The lips looked human. Mwah, 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 mwah. The question of what happened to Dr. Moss had temporarily left my head. I was far too fascinated with the monstrosity in the atrium. It wasn't until my phone rang that my attention shifted. Very quickly, the attention of the creature shifted as well. The thing went silent. Its symphony of yellowed eyes focused in on me. With a long, labored motion, the being started to suck at its lower lip. Before I had a chance to answer my phone, a hard chunk of spit left the creature's mouth. The glass wall of the atrium shattered, baptized in sharp crystals. I fell to the floor. I tried getting back up, but I was far too dizzy with shock, and all my palms could reach was crushed glass. With the grey-skinned creature quickly approaching and chewing at its lip once more, I reached at the closest thing I had to defend myself with, the lid of the crate. The wood sustained the creature's missile with a gentle dent, yet, soon enough, the worn logo of the star and snake started to melt away. Whatever the creature was spitting was highly corrosive. The creature's spit was acid. The creature's spit was acid, and it was crawling straight towards me. With its mouth preparing for another poisonous ball of phlegm, I was certain my death was near. With its yellow eyes glued to me, the creature chewed and crawled. I was certain my death was near. But then, with the blunt force of a shovel, I was saved. The old man must have left his house the moment I called, for he was still wearing his pajama shirt, with a range of motion wholly unnatural for an 80-year-old. Dr. Moss swung the shovel over and over, crushing and cutting the creature beneath its blade. The grey-fleshed beast quickly went limp, yet my relief didn't last. As Dr. Moss plunged the shovel into the creature, the tool started to wear away. The corrosive blood of the abomination was eating away at the shovel. Lighter fluid. Dr. Moss screamed as he swung the shovel once more. Bring the lighter fluid. With great difficulty and bleeding palms, I got to my feet and sprinted to the door leading to the atrium. With the shovel corroded down to a rake, I wasted no time pouring the accelerant. After a couple more labored swings of the destroyed tool, Dr. Moss produced a lighter and put the beast's cries to an end. I immediately started demanding Dr. Moss explain the nature of the abomination to me, but it quickly became apparent that the old man was in no position to shed light on anything, although he saved me. The shovel fight had taken its toll on Dr. Moss. He was having a heart attack. Getting him to the hospital on the slick roads was beyond nerve-wracking, but I did take comfort in putting distance between me and the unexplainable creature the whole way through, Doctor. Moss kept telling me to make sure I burn the creature. He kept saying that it was never meant to exist. He kept saying the evidence of the creature had to be destroyed. The last thing I wanted to do was to return to the facility, let alone handle the creature. Yet with the little consciousness Dr. Moss still possessed, he made me promise that I would. In complete silence, I drove back to the botanical garden once more. To my utter relief, I found the burnt remnants of the creature exactly where we had left them, sprawled out in a pool of black gunk and shattered glass. With the utmost caution, I scooped up the evidence with a new shovel from the tool shed, loaded it back into the crate and incinerated it all. Because I'm not family. The hospital won't provide me with any details about Dr. Moss, but from the sounds of it, he's alive. It's far too late to visit now, but I hope that soon I'll get to talk to him. I hope that soon I'll get answers to why that crate arrived at our facility. My dad was, and still is, my hero. I'm sure it sounds like just another worn-out cliché, and, hell, it might be, but it is very important to me that you remember this piece of information because, otherwise, all the things that I am going to tell you about, all the actions I've taken, will make me seem like a total lunatic. He was an anthropologist by trade, and you could tell from the moment you met him, even as young as I was. I knew that my dad loved people. He was fascinated by them, and he adored everything about them. It was woven into the dorky Hawaiian dad shirts he wore when he threw spontaneous backyard barbecues, tucked into his palm as he enthusiastically shook hands with every barista and bank teller he met, and etched into the crinkles of his eyes as he let out another boisterous laugh, the sort of laugh that made everyone else in the area want to laugh with him. People, it seems, loved him too. He wrote a lot of books, and apparently his personality shone even in writing because they sold incredibly well. It was after the smashing success of one book in particular, one discussing folk legends in our home state of Colorado, that he decided we would buy the vacation home. God, it seems bitterly ironic looking back on it now, but we'll get to that. The vacation home was in a tiny Welsh town called Arthurdeer. It was, as the Welsh name suggests, on the sea, and the town lined a semicircular divot in the country's coastline, flanked on either side by craggy cliffs, only a short distance out from the beach. Approximately where the center of the circle would be if it were completed, there was a tiny island. It was scarcely more than a large rock, harboring little besides a couple of small grottos and a smattering of gulls' nests. It was called Morgan's Isle. I only ever got to spend a couple of summers at the house, but I remember those summers very fondly. My dad was deeply interested in the area, not only because of his appreciation for Welsh culture, or what little remained after the gentrification of the area, but also because of some of the town's more unique attractions. Two in particular stand out to me as I reflect on it, and both involved the island, if you were outside at night, or when a dense fog had blanketed the town, you could hear a low, haunting melody rolling in off the sea. It was like someone playing the flute, resonant and mournful, far away across the water. My dad thought that it was the wind, catching in the cracks and crevices of Morgan's Isle and flowing back out across the water, friction from the sea-soaked rocks producing the ghostly howl. During the day, he said, the sounds of the town drowned it out, but at night, we would sit together on the back porch of the house and listen to the island sing across the inky sea. From our porch, it was also possible to observe the other phenomenon. If you looked out towards the island on a clear night, it was possible to see small, glittering points of light drifting over the dark water. They typically appeared in pairs, and they seemed to dip and swell as if riding atop the waves. My dad thought that it was a trick of the moonlight, perhaps an unusual reflection from something on the island or the shore, and he thought they were beautiful, like diamonds drifting on the sea, he said. And I looked up at him, stars in my eyes, and agreed. I was only 9 when he disappeared. He had decided that he was going to go out fishing for the day. We had a small boat, and he went out on it pretty frequently, leaving in the mid-morning and not returning until the last dregs of sunlight were slipping from the sky. Usually, he would let me come with, and I begged to go that day too, but he wouldn't let me. I'm still not sure why. Maybe I had been particularly clingy for the days preceding, or maybe he was planning to go out and do something dangerous that morning. I don't know, but I do know that as darkness fell that evening, he didn't come back, and he never did again. They found the boat, bashed up against the cliffs a few miles down the coast from Arthurdeer, but no sign of Dad. While accidents like this were uncommon in the area, they were not unheard of, and it was ultimately written off as an accidental drowning. They trawled the area for a while, looking for his body, but nothing turned up. And after the worst plane ride of our lives, my mom and I had to bury an empty casket. We didn't go back to the vacation home after that. We were all right financially, as my dad had left us a sizable chunk of savings to supplement my mom's income. But we couldn't face going back to where it had all happened. At the same time, though, my mom couldn't bear to get rid of the place. And so it's Saturday, falling into disrepair for 11 years, until a few days ago. I recently turned 20 and, after having something of an early life crisis, decided it was time to get some closure. My mom was not a big fan of my decision. If it was up to her, we would just let the house rot to nothing and never think about it again. But I had made up my mind, and before she could mount any real effort to stop me, I was bound for Cardiff Airport. I opted to check into Arthurdeer's small inns rather than attempting to stay in the house. This turned out to be a smart decision, as when I arrived at our old vacation home, it was in a state of severe disrepair. Being so close to the sea, weathering had taken its toll on the home's exterior, and the once well-kept garden had turned into a tangle of unkempt grass and thorny weeds. The interior was largely preserved, save for one room which had flooded through a hole in the roof, but a thick layer of dust had settled over what little furnishings had remained when we'd vacated the place. Evening was fast approaching, and I decided that it would be best if I returned to the inn to decide what to do with the place. As I was pushing through the door, I turned back one last time, half expecting to see my dad sitting on the stairs behind me, but no one was there. After a restless night, I decided to spend the next day, yesterday, out on the water. I bought some supplies from a dingy little tackle shop and slid into a rented boat in the harbour. As I chugged out into the sea, I had this eerie feeling that I was reliving my dad's last day. Peering across the glittering waves, my eyes snagged on a narrow cave tucked into the jagged flank of Morgan's Isle. I started steering towards it for a moment, but stopped myself. What was I doing? I'd seen people try to approach the cave before, and a patrol boat would always stop you, saying that it wasn't safe for public access, liable to collapse, they'd say. A tiny part of my brain whispered that they probably hadn't checked there. All those years ago, they would have thought that it was too dangerous, not worth the risk of searching. Maybe, just maybe. No, I shook my head as if to knock the idiotic thoughts out of my brain. I was there to get closure, not to open some silly, dangerous, and likely fruitless investigation. I found myself a good spot, a little ways past the island instead, and settled in for a day of fishing. I didn't end up catching anything. We had never caught much when I was younger anyway, and the years between had taken their toll on the already dwindling fish population. Besides, I could never quite completely wipe the thoughts of the cave from my mind. Before I knew it, the long, uneasy afternoon had slipped away into evening, and darkness spread quickly across the sky like a stain. As I rounded the island, I could see no other silhouettes against the shimmering lights of the town. I was alone on the water, and I was so close to the cave, I dragged my palms down my face. I knew I wouldn't get a wink of sleep if I didn't at least check. And, besides, now was the perfect opportunity, with no patrol boats crawling around. Hidden by the darkness of the open sea, I anchored the boat as close as I could to the tiny, rocky beach at the cave's mouth and splashed my way to the entrance, wincing as the icy water soaked into my sneakers. Standing on the gravel beach, I fumbled in my pocket. I was relieved to feel the clink of my keyring against my fingertips. Pulling it out, I pressed the button on the small flashlight that I kept clipped to the ring, and its weak beam cut through the darkness ahead of me. The small comfort that the light afforded me was dashed as I heard scuffling from behind some large stones just a few feet ahead. My hand shook as I pointed the flashlight toward the source of the sound, and I stumbled back as a figure moved from behind the rocks. "Dad." It had come out as a question, but as my disbelieving eyes flickered over the man in front of me, I was sure it was him. He was much older and far scruffier than he was when I'd last seen him, and he was still somewhat obscured by the shadows of the cave entrance. Still, I felt certain it was my dad. My heart leapt in elation, and I stumbled forward, slipping on the loose, wet gravel in my haste to embrace him. To my dismay, however, he started backwards, jerking out of the way of my open arms and slipping backwards, further into the cave. "There's no time, Carter." His voice was rough and strangled with disuse. "What?" He jerked his head backwards, indicating for me to follow him into the cave. I was so stunned by the strangeness of the interaction, by his sudden appearance, and by his form retreating further into the darkness of the cave, that I followed without question. At that moment, it seemed like the only thing I could do. While his strides seemed quick and practiced, mine were rendered unsteady by the slick rock beneath me. He was still just ahead of me, just on the edge of my flashlight beam, but I had to pick up my halted, slippery pace to keep up with him as he continued to press on. "There's no time for reunions yet. I promise you, all of that will come in due time, but for now I just need you to trust me." I was out of breath from our rapid pace, and, though questions burned at the tip of my tongue, I wasn't able to vocalize them. The walls of the cave seemed slightly closer now, and my claustrophobia built into a lump in my throat, further blocking any attempt at communication I might make. Years ago, the day I disappeared, I discovered a ritual site in the back of this cave, he explained, as I staggered onward. "I don't remember what happened between then and 2 days ago. All I know is that I woke up here, with the ritual site glowing around me. I managed to find out the date from a passing boat. I don't know what happened, Carter, and I'm so sorry for leaving you for so long, but I do know that something is happening tonight, in this cave. I don't know what will happen if we don't stop it, but I don't want to find out, and I need your help." My head was spinning with all the new information. He was still moving quickly in front of me, and, stunned as I was, I lost my focus for a moment, and, with it, my footing, my toe caught a small ledge on the ground beneath me, and I tripped, halting for a moment as I caught myself on my hands, scraping myself badly. However, it was not the pain that I noticed the moment I had stopped. So had my dad. I stood, slowly, and took another step forward. So did he. I took a few more, and he followed. But each time I stopped, he would too. It was as though he was determined to stay exactly as far from me as he was currently, just close enough to still be visible, just far enough to avoid the full power of my feeble flashlight beam. My blood ran cold. "Carter, come on," he said gruffly. Urgency, and something else that I know now to have been hunger, distorting his tone. "We have to hurry." That had been the point all along, hadn't it? To hurry me along, feed me lots of information all at once, give me no time to think. But now I was thinking. It was a plausible story. Sure, my dad had been a curious man, and if he had seen the same opportunity I had, it was certainly possible that he would have tried to explore the cave as well. An anthropologist would have been intrigued by a perceived ritual site, and, if something supernatural had indeed happened, it could explain his disappearance in the manner that he described. But something still bugged me. As I mentioned, my dad had always loved people. Now the first person he's seen in 11 years, even if those 11 years were a timeless blur, arrives at the cave and he spends no time greeting them, not even when that person is his own son. It didn't seem right. I tensed my hand around my keychain and, in one smooth motion, moved forward and focused the pale beam right on the figure in front of me. He jolted backward as quickly as he could, but it wasn't fast enough. Not this time, and I finally saw him for what he was. Sure, he looked a lot like my dad, an aged up, banged up version of him, tailor-made to look as if he'd been unconscious in a cave for 11 years. An excellent copy, but I could also see why he'd been avoiding the light. In the detail afforded by the dim light, I could see the way his limbs seemed slightly too long, The way his shoulders didn't quite slot in their sockets. The way his teeth seemed just a bit too large for his mouth. And his eyes. Christ, they were the same color as my dad's. Sure, but that is where the resemblance ended. They were empty, glassy, artificial, like the false eyes they stick in taxidermied animals. A poor imitation of the real thing. My dad was an anthropologist, and I know a person when I see one. This wasn't. The next few minutes are a blur in my memory. I remember sprinting back in the direction I'd come, slipping and sliding on the algae-coated stone beneath me. I could hear him chasing me. And, worse, I could hear more of them behind him, scampering through the cave on what sounded to me like wet, slippery, clawed hands and feet. As I ran, I kicked rocks backwards, hoping they would slow the creature's progress. I guess it must have worked, because the next thing I knew, I had flung myself into my boat and gunned it away from the island, not even bothering to look back and see how close an escape it had been. This brings me to today. As you might expect, I didn't sleep a wink. I spent the whole night researching, trying to figure out exactly what it was that happened to me. From what I've put together, it is likely that the first part of the story I was told was true. My dad probably did see the cave, seek the opportunity to explore it under the cover of darkness, and venture deep into it, hoping to discover a hidden anthropological treasure. But I don't think he found anything human in that horrible place, and I am certain now, even more than I was, that he is dead. Do you know where the name Morgan's Isle comes from? I certainly didn't. Before my midnight research session, I had always assumed that it was just named after an important figure in the area, like Jacksonville or Pennsylvania in the US. It turns out, though, that this is not the case. I doubt that many of the current residents of Arthur would pick up on the name's significance. Hardly any of them are Welsh, and fewer still are old enough or rooted enough in the area to remember any of the legends attached to it. As it turns out, a Morgan or Morgan is a Welsh term for a creature that entices men into its lair, usually with its beauty or enchanting voice, in order to drown or consume them. In the US, we might refer to this creature as a siren. I believe that it is likely these creatures that I encountered in the cave last night, and, if this is the case, there is no doubt in my mind that they are responsible for the disappearances of a number of visitors and locals alike over the years, including my poor father. As I am typing this, I'm sitting on the back porch of the old vacation home. My flight leaves tomorrow morning, and I have one more night in the grubby little inn up the road. But something called me back here, telling me to look out over the darkened sea one last time. I sincerely hope that it wasn't the sound that brought me here, that beautiful, achingly sorrowful timbre that echoes up the bluffs and draws me closer, sounding so much more melodic than it did all those years ago. Leaning in, I can see the flecks of light on the water again, tipping hypnotically up and down as waves roll by beneath them. I feel sick to my stomach. My dad was wrong. They aren't anything like diamonds. Looking at them now, I can see them for what they are. Fake, dead, empty, like taxidermy. Let me start at the beginning. 2 years ago, I wasn't doing so well. I came back stateside to find Jody had struck while I was gone. That led to some regrettable decisions and ultimately me living in my truck with a pair of felonies over my head. I didn't have much in the way of family either. A deceased father, absent mother, and a younger sister that had dropped off the radar before I went to the sandbox. So there I was, checking the P.O. box that my mail got forwarded to, now that my house no longer belonged to me. There was a letter from California sitting on top. At first I assumed it was junk mail. Luckily I didn't throw it out. Ignoring the stack of letters from various collectors, I opened the mystery envelope. It was a handwritten note. "Hey Clint, I should have written a long time ago. I heard you aren't doing so hot after getting back. Something I know a little too much about. I had assumed Uncle Sam had learned a thing or two about how to bring our boys home. Apparently not. Anyways, I can't fix not being there like I should have. What I can do is give you a chance at a fresh start. By the time this finds you, I'll be gone. All those issues the VA claims I don't have finally caught up to me. Anyhow, I never remarried after messing up the first 3 times, and I've been shooting blanks my whole life, so I'm writing this alone. I'm selling my house and belongings. It should more than cover my end-of-life care. I'm leaving you my cabin and any proceeds left over. You'll find a key to the cabin and a business card for the lawyer I used to set everything up in the envelope. I haven't been up to the cabin in years, but I hope it serves you well. It was signed Uncle Cassius, my dad's brother. I had met him a few times throughout my life. He wasn't someone I was close with. I was honestly surprised he even knew who I was. I dumped the old brass key into the palm of my hand. I stared at it for a long time. Uncle Cassius had always been a cantankerous man, willing to throw fists over any perceived slight. This act of generosity was highly out of character. I didn't call the number on the card until the next day. The whole thing felt unreal. When I finally worked up the nerve to call the lawyer, it went smoother than expected. The lawyer? A Miss Ladeau suggested I come to her office to finalize papers. There was nothing keeping me at my current location, and plenty of reasons to leave. I tied up whatever loose ends I had in the area and hit the road that night. After a quick shave and shower at the local truck stop, I headed over to the firm's office. I found myself standing in front of a modern 4-story building of glass and steel. I double and triple checked the address before heading in. I made my way to the front desk. The 20-something blonde spoke without looking up from whatever she was typing. Sorry, no public restrooms. There is a gas station 2 blocks down the road. That stung a bit, but I tried not to show it. Actually, I'm here to meet with a Miss Ladeau. The girl looked up from her computer. She eyed my clothes and even went as far as to flare her nostrils slightly, as if picking up an unpleasant scent. I mean, she probably was, but still, that's just rude. Name? She asked. Clint Walker. She scrolled through her computer. Ah, here we are. Very well, Mr. Walker. If you'll have a seat, I'll let Miss Ladeau know you're here. I barely had time to pick up a magazine and sample the nut platter before the click of heels got my attention. A brunette woman in a smart business suit and skirt walked up to me. She had an air of authority about her that instinctually made me want to salute. She smiled as she approached, revealing a set of perfectly straight teeth. Mr. Walker, it's so nice to meet you in person. I stood and shook her hand. She had a surprisingly firm grip. She motioned for me to follow her. We took the elevator to the top floor, then walked to her office in the corner. The large windows looked towards the snow-covered peaks in the distance. Miss Ladeau sat behind her desk. I took one of the seats facing her. She laced her fingers together and took a long look at me. She seemed to be weighing me with her gaze. Finally, she broke the silence. You didn't know your uncle very well, did you? I shook my head. No, I can't say that I did. I don't think I saw him more than half a dozen times my entire life. She slid a paper over to me. A quick scan of it showed it pretty much said what Uncle Cassius's letter had said, but in more legal-sounding language. She handed me a pen next. It's strange that Cassius would give his inheritance to someone who's nearly a stranger, but weirder things have happened. Her use of his first name didn't escape me. I carefully read through the contract. I hate to sound inconsiderate, but do you know how much money was left after paying all his bills? She raised an eyebrow at my question. I shrugged my shoulders. I'm not doing so well financially right now. I don't want to take ownership of the cabin if it means losing it, because I can't pay the property taxes or your fees. She dug into her folder and pulled out a bank statement. Currently, all of Cassius's debts are covered, as well as this year's taxes. Our fees are being waived as well. What you see is what you will be receiving. It wasn't a ton, but it would get me by. I scribbled my signature on the paper before handing it back to her. Curiosity got the better of me. What was your relationship with Cassie? I asked. It was her turn to pause. She neatly stacked the signed papers before placing them in her folder. Well, to make a long story short, my father and your uncle become good friends over the last 10 years. I would tag along with my dad on his yearly hunting trips with your uncle. I guess that made sense as to why a high-end lawyer would be handling a lowly estate pro bono, and why I was picking up a hint of resentment. Would you like to see the cabin now or after you've settled in? We can go right now, I asked. She nodded. If you would like. That would be great. I want to get an idea as to what kind of shape it's in. It's fine for you to leave in the middle of a workday. Miss Ladeau walked past me. As she did, she pointed to the office door. My name on the door means I can leave when I need to. In the parking lot, she scribbled an address on a piece of paper and handed it to me. Just in case we get separated. She Saturday in a white late model Audi SUV. She threw her high-heeled shoes onto the passenger side of the car before closing the door. I got into my pickup and followed her out of town. The road gently swayed from side to side as we cruised past the lush evergreens. When there was a break in the trees, I could see the snow-covered mountain reaching into the clouds ahead. The farther we drove, the older the houses and barns grew, and the larger the plots of land they Saturday on became. Horses and cattle roaming grass-covered hills became the norm. Soon even they faded, replaced by endless trees rising high above us and stretching out to the edge of my vision. The road grew rougher. There was no guardrail or shoulder, just a single line in the center. The road signs were riddled with holes, likely from drunken locals who had grown bored living in a small town. The Audi's brake lights lit up before it dipped off to the left. I followed onto a very primitive private road. A broken gate hung off to the side, nearly enveloped in ivy. 2 ruts led up the hill with bushes pushing in on both sides. I was surprised the SUV made it all the way to the top. We parked side by side and I got out of my truck. Knee-high grass surrounded the building. It was made of hand-cut logs and had a cedar-shake roof. The windows had long since been covered with plywood. The wrap-around porch had grass growing up through it, and the railing had fallen down years ago. I made my way to the front door. Even if I didn't already have a key, I wouldn't have needed Miss Ledoux to unlock it for me. The jamb was so badly rotten the door simply pushed open. The interior smelled awful. It had a wet dog-like scent to it. Doing my best to ignore the smell, I walked around the small 2-bedroom single-story cabin. I walked in the master bedroom. In the closet, the smell was unbearable. That was when I noticed a trap door leading to the crawl space. The smell was clearly coming from below. I closed the lid and latched it. Instantly, the smell lessened. Miss Ledoux came in holding her nose shut. "Thank God you found the source," she commented. I noticed she had traded the high heels for hiking boots and had her hair up in a ponytail. She had also ditched the suit jacket. We walked through the rest of the cabin. There was no water or power currently. The toilet was full of black mold as well as the shower. The roof seemed to be holding water out, but the exterior was showing its neglect. There was a small barn a few hundred feet from the cabin. It was just big enough to fit 2 vehicles in the center and some animals along the sides with a small hayloft. There was a Ford 8N loader tractor parked inside, but the batteries and fuel had long since gone bad, as had the few bales of hay that had been left behind. Like the cabin, the barn had some rot, but the roof was holding water out, saving the majority of the structure. We spent a decent bit of time going over papers before Miss Ledoux gave me my stack. "Here you go, Mr. Walker. You are officially the owner." "Clint is fine," I told her. "Thanks for everything. If it's not too much bother, I would love to hear some of the stories you must have of my uncle someday." She shot me a smile as she climbed into her car. "You have my number. And by the way, it's Lucy." With that, she drove away. As the crunch of her tires faded away, I looked back at the cabin. In the fading light, it looked even worse than it had earlier. The stillness the setting sun brought with it made me shiver. I wouldn't be sleeping here tonight, that was for sure. The lack of water and power on top of the smell was enough to assure me I needed to find a hotel for the next few nights. I did just that. I booked a room at the crummy motel in town for a week. It felt blissful to be able to lie down on a bed and stretch out. I'm not a tall man, but I'm taller than my truck is wide. Using the bench seat for a bed, the past dozen or so months gave me a real appreciation for a queen-size bed. I probably spent longer than was polite in the shower, but I didn't care enough not to. Afterwards, as I lay in bed, my thoughts busy with possibilities. I could sell the cabin. No doubt it would get me some money to get by for quite a while. But if my ex-wife caught wind of it, she would likely find a way to take most of it. I had some cash now. I could invest in the property, find a local job and start paying off some of my debts. My ex might try to up her cut, but no matter what I did, she would probably do something. I must have bounced off at some point. My phone ringing woke me up. Groaning, I rolled over and put it to my ear. "Hello, where are you?" The voice was too familiar for my liking. Annabelle, my ex-wife. Why do you care? I Saturday up fully awake now. Don't get smart with me, Clint. You left in the middle of the night. I want my check. Don't think you can run away from me. I winced at her grating voice. Okay, maybe it wasn't that bad, but to me it was the worst sound on earth. Don't worry about your money, Anna. It'll be on time, and the full amount. She was quiet. That was never a good thing. Does that mean you found a better job? Yep, there it was. No, but I got a one-time payment for something, and you'll get your cut. She replied with that voice as smooth as arsenic-laced honey good to know Clint. The line went dead, and I flopped back onto the bed. Fuck me sideways. With my morning already ruined, I decided to make the best of it by heading to the cabin. On my way, I stopped by a hardware store and grabbed some lumber and tools. I wanted to fix the door for sure, as well as remove the plywood covering the windows. I needed to make a list and budget out repairs before moving forward. The drive was just under an hour. With the price of gas in California, I was going to have to make my trips up count, or my old truck would bleed me dry. The cabin didn't look any better. Actually, the door was now laying on the ground. Apparently, I had gotten its last use out of it the night before. Before I even entered, I could smell the scent that wafted out the doorway. I could almost feel the odor seeping into my skin. The smell made my decision for me. The first thing I was going to do was remove the plywood and get some windows open. It took a lot longer than I expected. Whoever had put up the wood had nailed the ever-living shit out of them and buried the nails deep into the boards. A couple hours later, I had the windows uncovered. They were single pane and from the 80s, but I had seen worse. Opening them all brought in a decent amount of fresh air. The power was still shut off. The electric company said they would be out later this week to turn it back on. I took a walk around the yard in search of the well. It was pretty easy to find. There was a ring of stones with a wood lid over the top. I flipped the lid off and gagged at the smell. It was the same wet dog smell that permeated the interior of the cabin. Trying not to inhale, I cranked the hand pump. Unfortunately, it took several minutes to get water up. It took even longer to get clear water. I filled a bottle with the water. I would send it off to get tested when I got back to town. I replaced the lid and walked back to the house. The smell was more tolerable now. I was worried the wood floors and paneling would absorb it and never smell right again. Next, I tackled the bathroom. It took a couple gallons of bleach, but I got rid of all the mold I could find. I noticed the light was starting to get dim and decided to call it a day. As I was packing up, I remembered the door. I cursed in frustration. Glancing at the low-hanging sun made me uneasy. I really didn't want to be here after sunset, but I also didn't want animals getting in the cabin. I told myself to stop being a bitch and get to work. I pulled the old rotten wood free and started framing in a new doorway. It was getting hard to see, so I started up my truck and pointed the headlights at the door. As I was hammering away, I kept feeling the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. It wasn't a nice feeling at all. More than once I caught myself looking over my shoulder into the black forest surrounding me. I was starting to sweat. I didn't like this one bit. Finally, I decided to throw up one of the pieces of plywood I had pulled from the window and call it good enough. After quickly securing the wood, I threw my tools into my truck and climbed in. I was moving too fast. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. My heart raced as I sped away. Once I got onto the main road, a shiver ran through my body. I was pissed. My fight or flight instinct hadn't been triggered so badly since traveling the Spin-Gar Mountains. Yet here I was in a cold sweat over some quiet-ass trees. My bad mood persisted through the night. I woke up the next day ready to continue cleaning up the property. I brought a few gallons of gas and a new 6-volt battery with me, as well as a generator. Soon I was pulling up to the crappy little cabin. The feelings from the night before came rushing back. The plywood I had nailed up was lying in the middle of the yard, broken into a dancing pieces. I sat in my truck contemplating what I should do next. Finally, with a sigh, I opened the door and climbed out of the truck. Carefully, I walked into the cabin. There was muddy smudges on the floor as well as the windows. Nothing clear enough to tell me what made the tracks, but it was obvious something had been wandering around after I left. The terrible odor was back and worse than ever. I glanced into the master bedroom and paused. The crawl space hatch was open again. The latch was intact, but the hole was wide open. Heart in my throat, I walked up to it. painfully aware of how loud the floor was under my boots. I didn't dare poke my head in and look around. Hell, I didn't even dare to stick my phone down there and take a video. I decided my best bet was to close it again. I double-checked to make sure the latch was secure this time. Then I nailed it shut and set the biggest rock I could find on top of it. I hung a new front door and made sure both locks worked. With the house secure, I finished a few other small projects before heading to town for dinner. While enjoying a nice T-bone with mashed potatoes, I noticed they had a football game playing in the bar area. Once I finished my meal and paid my bill, I headed over to the bar. I ordered a Moscow Mule and settled in to watch the game. I had barely finished my second drink when two college kids Saturday on either side of me. I glanced at the abundance of empty chairs around, but chose to order another drink rather than make a big deal over it. I finished my drink and decided to call it a night. As I stood up, one of the guys grabbed my wrist. He looked at me like I had pissed in his cornflakes. "You the one driving that truck?" He pointed out the window to my pickup. I pulled my arm free from his grip. "Yeah, that's mine. What about it?" They looked at each other. "I think you should get in it and drive right out of town. Don't bother looking back." I felt a calmness enter me. It felt good. I asked, "And why would I do something like that?" They both stood and glared at me. They were probably a couple years younger than me. They were fit and their buzz cuts screamed LEO or military. The bigger of the two put his face right up to mine. "Because you don't belong here, and you sure as hell don't need to be poking around that cabin." He was red in the face. His eyes were bulging with indignation. I smiled at him. Rubbing my hands together at chest height, I spoke softly. "You'll have to get used to it. I'm not going anywhere. In fact, I think I'll build a second cabin up there." I'll admit his swing caught me by surprise. I hadn't expected him to lose his cool so quickly. Lucky for me, it was a pretty shitty punch and just grazed my cheek. The quick jab I threw into his nose, on the other hand, resulted in a shower of blood and him stumbling backwards. His buddy took a step forwards. It was probably out of instinct, but I took it as an invitation. I put my boot into his shin and drove my knee into his face as he was heading for the floor. The first fella had regained enough of his wits to see my second punch coming. It caught him in the mouth. His lips didn't appreciate me trying to push them through his teeth like Play-Doh in kindergarten class. It was time to go. I left the two wannabe tough guys on the floor and headed out. It was a short drive to the motel where I slept off the night's adventure. I woke up late. I had a message on my phone from the power company. My cabin had electricity again. If I wanted, I could start sleeping there and save some money. I didn't really like that idea. I packed up my things and turned in my room key. I wasn't going to let fear hold me down. I had faced worse things than these woods had to offer and walked away with my life. After a quick stop to get some needed things, I headed up to me cabin. I was nearly to the cut-off zone where cell service got spotty when my phone rang. I pulled off onto the shoulder and answered, "Hello." A familiar voice came through. "Clint, did you get into a physical altercation last night?" It was Lucy Ladeau. I decided to answer honestly. "Yeah, you could say that. How did you hear about it?" She sighed. "It's a small town." "Well, that, and my friend is the nurse that patched them up. You're lucky you know a good lawyer. The sheriff is going to be at your cabin shortly. Be polite. Let me do my thing, and hopefully this will all go away." I thanked her before pulling onto the road and driving to my cabin. I guess it made sense. I wasn't really thinking about the law when I decked that guy. Regardless, I hoped Lucy could handle it. I started the day by ripping out the old deck. I hadn't been working long when a silver Suburban rolled up. Even though it was unmarked, it was clearly a police car. Tossing the hammer and crowbar aside, I waited as the sheriff approached. I could see my reflection in his aviator sunglasses. He was an older man, probably late 50s or early 60s, a bit portly and rocking a robust handlebar mustache. He didn't say a word as he placed one foot on the bottom step. He pulled a cigarette out of his breast pocket, placed it in his mouth and lit it. "Clint Walker, you're not real big on first impressions, are you?" He didn't give me a chance to answer. Instead, he continued, "Those boys you banged around want your head on a platter, and I'm considering giving them just that. Wouldn't be too hard, seeing as how you're on probation." "Listen here," I interrupted. "Those two started it. He cut me off. Shut your mouth, boy. I don't give a shit. You came into my town and started trouble. You sell this place and get out by the weekend, or I'll see you end up in prison for life this time." Before I could argue, he stormed back to his Suburban and peeled out as he left.
Damn it.
I cursed. I kicked the porch railing, sending rotten wood flying. I took my phone out of my pocket and called Lucy. She answered on the third ring. "Hey, you got any good news for me?" There was a pause, followed by a long sigh. "Clint, the sheriff and mayor of this town, are brothers, and you busted up both their sons. No, I don't have much good news for you. It doesn't look good, especially not with you being on probation for a previous violent crime." I hung up. Just when life was starting to turn around, this had to happen. I focused on my breathing, something I learned after my service. Just find something. The breeze. It smelled like wet leaves. It felt cool. I took another breath. I see trees. I smell leaves. I feel the cool breeze. Another breath. When I calmed down, I called Lucy back and apologized. She accepted my apology but sounded annoyed. She suggested I head to her office to discuss things in person. So I packed up my tools and got into my truck. I was driving on autopilot, my mind filled with dread, when a flash caught my eye. I stopped the truck. I was still a ways from the main road. Putting the truck in reverse, I backed up a few hundred feet. To my left was a hole in the brush. Deep in the woods, I could see the sun glinting off a silver Suburban. I'm not afraid to say I Saturday there for a moment and contemplated driving away. I rolled down my window. "Hey, Sheriff, you down there?" When there was no reply, I got out of the truck. I pushed through the broken bushes and made my way to the wrecked vehicle. The passenger side was caved in, the windows all blown out. Peering in showed an empty driver's seat. In fact, the entire driver's door was missing. I took a nervous look around. The woods were dead quiet. There was a trail of destruction leading deeper into the woods. I had a choice: follow the foreboding trail or call the authorities. I decided to call it in. I described what happened the best I could. Then I walked back to my truck and Saturday on the hood and waited. Before long, I saw red and blue lights coming up the road. 2 patrol cars pulled up. 4 deputies approached me, each one wearing a grim look on their face. Before I had a chance to say anything, one of them grabbed my arm and twisted it behind my back. He slammed my head down on the hood of my truck. "Okay, asshole, what happened?" "You get mad and run him off the road." I tried to stand up, only to be pushed back down. "No, I didn't. Look at his rig and at mine. There's not a scratch on mine." One of the other deputies leaned over and looked at my truck. "He's got a point, Zane. How about you cut the tough guy act and we start looking for Les?" I felt the pressure on my arm release. Rubbing my shoulder, I turned to the 4 officers. Down there, I pointed to where to Suburban lay. "Zane." Murdoch and Anderson approached the wreck. Johnson hung back, standing by me. As the others looked over the Suburban, Johnson leaned closer to me. In a low voice, he asked, "You wouldn't happen to have a clue as to what happened here, would you?" I shook my head. "No idea. I was heading to town and just happened to catch sight of it on my way out." Murdoch walked past us on his way back to the patrol cars. As he passed, he gave Johnson a look I couldn't discern. Johnson's shoulders slumped, and he muttered under his breath, "Fucking hell. Here we go." Zane and Anderson were having a quiet conversation. They had a haunted look about them. "Is there something I should be aware of?" I asked Johnson. He let a humorless chuckle escape. "Don't worry about it. Go home. We'll handle this." I snorted. "Yeah, that's not happening. I'm coming along. Finding the sheriff is the only way we're clearing my name." Murdoch returned carrying 4 rifles. He handed one to each of the other deputies. "Those don't look standard issue," I commented. Johnson pulled back and released the charging handle on the FN scar it is for this area. He walked down to the others, and they began following the trail. I walked behind them as they moved forward. They reminded me of how my old squad would clear streets. For all our sakes, I hoped they had better luck than we had. It wasn't long before we came across the car door. Despite the long gashes in the steel running the length of it, the deputies barely spared it a glance as they pushed deeper into the woods. The trail led us up a steep incline. We slowly crawled our way to the top. Anderson pointed out some drops of blood on the ground. Past the blood, the trail grew much fainter. We were all out of breath at this point. Zane and Anderson wanted to push on. Murdoch pointed out the time. We had 3 hours until sunset. Johnson ended up siding with Zane and Anderson. We pushed on. I was lost in thought when Zane Frouncy, he held up a hand. The others took up positions around him, each one tensely shouldering their rifle. The trees around us stood silent. Then the smell hit me. It was rank, like rotten mushrooms and wet dog. The air grew thick with tension. Anderson's breathing grew labored. I could see sweat rolling down Murdoch's temple. He let go of the foregrip of his rifle to wipe it away. In the split second that his muzzle dropped, something slammed into him. Murdoch hit the ground hard, his rifle sending a shot into the sky. Johnson fired multiple rounds over Murdoch into the surrounding bushes. At the same time, Zane fired in the opposite direction. A scream rang out, cutting through the air. It sounded like a cross between a cougar and a boar. It sounded pissed. I grabbed Murdoch by his plate carrier and pulled him to his feet. As he took up position again, I reached around behind him and drew his service gun from its holster. He didn't take his eyes off the nearby brush, but whispered angrily, "That's mine, fucker." I turned to Johnson. What the hell was that? It was Zane that answered me. "It's none of your concern." I winged it. Hopefully that buys us enough time to get the sheriff and get out of here. Seeing that no one was going to offer any more information, I let it go. The four of them continued to follow the trail. I kept close as they did. Handgun or not, I didn't want anything to do with whatever creature Zane shot. Plus, if it didn't go down after getting hit with a 7.62 X51, I sure as hell wasn't going to kill with a 9mm. I checked the gun. Turns out it's a 10mm and had a round chambered. These guys came prepared for something big. I was really beginning to regret coming along. Zane must have been a miracle tracker because he kept a steady pace through the foliage. If it wasn't for the random specks of blood every 20 or so feet, I would have assumed he was traveling blind. A massive branch snapped to my left, the sound echoing through the trees. I turned toward the sound. Anderson slammed into my back, knocking me to the ground. He began screaming and writhing on top of me. Gunfire erupted from all around. Over the ringing in my ears, I heard Zane yelling at Anderson to hold still. I got up to one knee and quickly scanned the woods. Seeing nothing, I turned to Anderson. 3 long gouges ran from his shoulder blade to his elbow. He was bleeding profusely and screaming all the while Zane was trying to pack the wound. Johnson and Murdoch were on constant swivel watching the perimeter. Probation be fucked. I grabbed Anderson's discarded rifle. Shouldering it, I stayed low and searched for movement in the brush. Zane managed to get Anderson under control. He was still moaning and his eyes were entirely dilated, but the screaming had stopped. "What are we up against?" I asked no one in particular. Zane glanced at me but didn't answer. It was Johnson that finally explained. "There's something living under the mountain. They're fast, aggressive and tough. They normally only come out at night, but something has them riled up. There's a toxin on their claws that induces nightmarish hallucinations." I didn't like that answer one bit. What are the chances the sheriff is even alive? This time Zane answered decent. If they wanted him dead, we would have found pieces of him all over his patrol rig. I didn't find that reassuring at all. Johnson checked his watch. "It doesn't look good, Zane. We're running out of time and we're a man down. I think it's time to split up." I thought that was a crazy idea, but Zane nodded his head. "Yeah, if we're going to have any chance at this, you and I need to push forward and find Les, while Walker here and Murdoch carry Anderson back." I looked at each one thinking surely there was a better option. To my shock, they all seemed to be in agreement. I wanted to argue with them, to convince them all to leave and come back with the National Guard or something, but their minds were made up. So that's what we did. Murdoch and I did our best to support Anderson as we returned the way we came. Zane and Johnson disappeared into the forest in search of their missing boss. Despite the constant feeling of being watched, we made it back to the gravel road without incident. By the time we arrived, the sun was low in the sky. It looked like Johnson and Zane would be spending the night in the woods. Murdoch stumbled, causing me to nearly drop Anderson. Murdoch cussed loudly. Looking up, I saw why. The 2 patrol cars had been reduced to shredded rubber and twisted metal. It looked like someone had pulled them apart with a pair of giant knives. Even my truck had a couple flat tires and a hole in the radiator. A look of defeat filled Murdoch's face. I gave him a small nudge. "Come on, man. It's not dark yet." We can still make it back to my cabin if we hurry. Murdoch looked up at me blankly before slowly nodding. Getting up off his knees, he helped me drag a now unconscious Anderson up the road. It was pitch black by the time we got to the cabin. Rather than stay inside the cabin with all its large windows, we made our way to the barn. Once inside, we closed it up tight and barricaded the door. We climbed into the hayloft and did our best to get comfortable. With our backs to the wall and rifles facing the ladder, we tried to sleep in short shifts. Around midnight, we heard a barrage of gunfire in the distance. It lasted about a minute before the night fell silent once more. It remained quiet until the sun came up, and with it, the chirping of birds. "We need backup and an evac," I said as Murdoch inspected Anderson's wounds. He glanced up at me but didn't say anything. "He will die if those get infected, and I don't think Zane and Johnson are coming back." Murdoch lunged at me. His sudden attack took me by surprise, and within seconds he was on top of me. He got in a few good hits before I was able to get a leg around his neck and pin him down. His struggles were pointless, and we both knew it, but he needed the challenge. He needed something to fight. Once Murdoch chilled out, I let him go. "You're right. We need to get help here. But I doubt our radios are in working order, and I don't have cell service." "I do." He looked at me in shock. "You've got a phone?" I shook my head. "Not on me. It's in my truck. You guys didn't give me a chance to retrieve it." Murdoch's shoulders slumped. "Then it might as well be a million miles away." "What do you mean?" "It's only a half-mile down the road." He looked at me. "Oh yeah? And are you going to walk down there and get it? Those things aren't limited to night hunting, and they're smart enough to know we'll be returning to the cars at some point." I lifted the rifle. "Let them come. I'm not sitting here until he dies and we starve to death. Plus, judging by what they did to the cars, I doubt these barn walls are all that safe." Murdoch shook his head. "You'll never make it, but I won't stop you from trying." Choosing to ignore his pessimism, I climbed down from the hayloft. My heart was beating hard as I scanned the yard. It looked clear. I crossed the open area quickly. I took cover in the trees, but I didn't feel any safer amongst them. Carefully, I crept through the woods, my whole body on high alert. Each noise caused me to freeze and wait. More than once, I swore there was a trace scent on the breeze. It probably took me an hour to reach the cars, even though it felt like a lifetime. The vehicles looked like nothing had disturbed them after we left. They Saturday there like a forbidden fruit just waiting to be plucked. I almost rushed to my truck, but I remembered Murdoch's warning about traps. I stayed low in the brush. I scanned the area carefully. Across the road between two fern bushes, there was a shadow. I couldn't tell if it was something or not. I Saturday in my crouched position. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. I would have made my move at 30, but the shadow shifted. And not just a little. It turned 90 degrees. I couldn't make out much other than it was pretty big. Quadrupedal and about 5 feet tall. I took careful aim. Bear. Sasquatch or something else, I didn't care. The gun bucked in my hand. I kept the sights on target. It screamed like the one Zane had hit the night before. It took a couple quick steps in my direction, but a few more rounds striking its body discouraged it. The thing never left the shadows enough for me to get a good look at it. Instead, it ran deeper into the woods, screaming its heart out. I took a quick look around, then sprinted for my truck. Sliding into the driver's seat, I turned the key. The small block V8 came to life just like she always did. The flat tires made it nearly impossible to stay on the road, and within minutes the engine was boiling out its last bit of coolant. Driving with one hand, I opened the glove box and took out my phone with the other. I drove like a madman while checking for a few fleeting glimpses of service. There, I had 3 bars just a mile down the road. I smashed the brake pedal and slid to a stop. My phone vibrated again and again. 6 missed calls from Lucy, 2 voicemails. I hit the play button on the voicemail while trying to get to 911. Lucy's voice came on. "Hey Clint, it sounds like you're having some troubles up there. Don't do anything rash, okay? I'll be up there as quick as I can." I stared at the phone in horror. The second voicemail started automatically. Lucy was whispering, "Clint, please pick up. I can't get through to 911. There's something in the woods. I know it's crazy, but I think they dropped a tree across the road." Just please answer. A lump formed in my throat. Lucy had been stuck on the road all night, stuck trying to help me. I slammed my hands onto the steering wheel in frustration. I had planned on calling in help for the officers and then driving until the truck died and walking off the mountain. But I couldn't, not if Lucy was in trouble because of me. So I called the police station. I told them everything. It sounded like they were going to send every available person. I'm posting this in case things don't go well. I need people to know what happened. I just hope my single bar of internet is enough for it to go through. I'm going to try and find Lucy. If she's alive, I'll escort her off the mountain. And if she's not, at least I can offer her family some closure. The salt-laden wind whipped through the narrow streets of Blackwater Cove, carrying with it the ever-present stench of rotting fish and something far more insidious. I pulled my worn jacket tighter around my shoulders, quickening my pace as I made my way down to the docks. The early morning fog clung to the weathered buildings, obscuring the upper floors and giving the impression that the town simply faded away into nothingness. I've lived in this godforsaken place my entire life, watching as it slowly decayed like a beached whale left to the elements. Blackwater Cove was once a thriving fishing village, but now it's little more than a collection of dilapidated houses and empty storefronts. The fish that once filled our nets have long since disappeared, replaced by other things. As I rounded the corner onto Wharf Street, I nearly collided with old man Thaddeus. His rheumy eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed with suspicion. "Watch where you're going, Ezra," he growled, his voice like gravel in a cement mixer. "Ain't safe to be wandering about, especially not with the tide coming in." I nodded, trying to sidestep him, but his gnarled hand shot out and gripped my arm with surprising strength. "You'd do well to remember what happened to your pa," he hissed, leaning in close enough that I could smell the tobacco on his breath. "Some things are best left forgotten." With that cryptic warning, he shambled off, leaving me standing there with a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. I shook off the encounter and continued toward the docks, my steps echoing hollowly on the old wooden planks. The fishing boats bobbed listlessly in the grey water, their paint peeling and their decks empty. No one goes out anymore, not since the incident. It's been 3 years since that day, but the memory of it still haunts my dreams. I made my way to the end of the pier, where my own small boat was moored, the Molly's Revenge, named after my mother, who disappeared when I was just a boy. As I untied the ropes and prepared to cast off, I felt the familiar weight of eyes upon me. Glancing back toward the shore, I saw a group of townspeople gathered at the edge of the dock. Their faces were a mixture of concern, fear, and something else. Hunger, perhaps. Or was it envy? "Ezra," a voice called out. It was Octavia, the librarian's daughter, her red hair a stark contrast to the drab surroundings. "Please, don't go out there. You know what happens when the fog rolls in." I waved her off, trying to ignore the plea in her voice. "I'll be fine, Octavia. Someone has to bring in food, or we'll all starve." As I pushed off from the dock, I heard muttering from the assembled crowd. Words like fool and cursed drifted across the water, but I paid them no mind. They didn't understand. They couldn't understand. The fog thickened as I navigated through the channel, the familiar landmarks of the coast disappearing one by one until I was surrounded by a blank, grey void. The only sound was the gentle lapping of waves against the hull and the distant, mournful cry of a foghorn. I checked my watch, 8:17 a.m. The tide would be turning soon, and with it would come the changes. I had to work quickly. Cutting the engine, I let the boat drift as I prepared my nets. The old techniques didn't work anymore, not since the waters had become tainted. Now, we had to use different bait, different methods that would have horrified our ancestors. From a locked cooler beneath the deck, I retrieved a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. My hands trembled slightly as I unwrapped it, revealing a chunk of meat. Dark and glistening, I tried not to think about where it came from, or the muffled screams I'd heard coming from the old cannery last night. With practiced movements, I attached the bait to a specially designed hook and lowered it into the water. Then, I waited. Minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. The fog pressed in around me, so thick now that I could barely see the bow of my own boat. And then, I felt it, a subtle change in the air, a shift in the very fabric of reality. The water began to roil and bubble, as if boiling from beneath. A foul stench rose up, making my eyes water and my stomach churn, and then breaking the surface with a sound like tearing flesh. It appeared. I'd seen it before. Of course, we all had. But no matter how many times I witnessed it, the sight never failed to fill me with a primal, existential dread. It was massive, easily dwarfing my boat. Its skin, if you could call it that, was a sickly, bioluminescent green that pulsed with an inner light. Countless tentacles, each as thick as a man's torso, writhed and twisted in the air. But it was the eyes, oh God, the eyes that truly captured the horror of the thing. Hundreds of them, ranging in size from a pinhead to a dinner plate, covered its amorphous body, and every single one was fixed on me. I forced myself to breathe, to focus on the task at hand. This was why I came out here. After all, this was the price we paid for our continued existence. With shaking hands, I reached for the harpoon gun mounted on the side of the boat. The harpoon itself was no ordinary weapon. Its tip was fashioned from a strange, iridescent metal that had washed up on our shores in the wake of the first appearance. It was the only thing we'd found that could pierce the creature's hide. As I took aim, a tendril shot out of the water, wrapping around the boat's railing. Another followed, and another. The creature was pulling itself closer, its massive bulk displacing so much water that waves threatened to capsize my small vessel. I fired the harpoon, the recoil nearly knocking me off my feet. There was a sound like shattering glass, and then a shriek that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was a sound of pain, yes, but also of rage and hunger. The harpoon had found its mark, burying itself deep in what passed for the thing's flesh. Ihor, black as night and thick as tar, oozed from the wound. But instead of retreating, the creature pressed its attack. Tentacles lashed out, slamming against the boat and sending spray everywhere. I stumbled, nearly falling overboard, and in that moment of distraction, a smaller tendril wrapped around my ankle. The touch burned like acid, and I screamed in agony as I was lifted into the air. Dangling upside down, I found myself face to face with the nightmare made flesh. Its countless eyes blinked in unison, and I swear I saw something like recognition in their depths. And then it spoke. Not with words, not exactly, but somehow its thoughts invaded my mind, bypassing my ears entirely. The voice was ancient, vast, and utterly alien. Ezra, it said, and hearing my name in that inhuman tone nearly drove me mad on the spot. You have come again, as your father did, as his father did. I thrashed wildly, trying to break free, but the creature's grip was implacable. What do you want? I managed to gasp out. Washington NT. The thing seemed almost amused. I Washington NT nothing. I am, and because I am, you are. Without me, your kind would have perished long ago. Memories flashed through my mind, memories that weren't my own. I saw Blackwater Cove as it once was, centuries ago. I saw the first encounter between my ancestors and this entity. I saw the pact that was made, the price that was paid, the curse, I whispered, understanding dawning like a brutal sunrise. It's not a curse at all, is it? It's a bargain. Astute, Little O Northeast. Yes, a bargain. My presence keeps the Washington Ters rich, the storms at bay. In exchange, I require sustenance. The implications of that last word hit me like a physical blow. The disappearances over the years, the strange meat we used as bait, the sounds from the cannery, it all made horrifying sense. But why? I asked, my voice cracking. Why us? Why here? The creature's thoughts pressed against my mind once more, and I got the distinct impression of amusement. Why does the tide me in? Why do the stars wheel overhead? I am, and so it must be. With that, the tentacle around my ankle loosened, dropping me unceremoniously back onto the deck of my boat. I lay there, gasping and shaking, as the entity began to sink back beneath the waves. "Remember our bargain, Ezra," it said, its voice fading. "The Northeast XT offering is due soon. Do not disappoint me." And then it was gone, leaving nothing but churning water and the lingering stench of its presence. The fog began to dissipate, revealing the coastline of Blackwater Cove in the distance. As I started the engine and pointed the boat toward home, my mind raced. What was I going to tell the others? How could we continue living like this, knowing the true nature of our curse? But deep down, I knew the answer. We would go on as we always had. We would make the offerings, keep the bargain, and pray that the cosmic horror lurking beneath our waves remained satisfied. Because the alternative, the entity's hunger unleashed upon the world, was too terrible to contemplate. As I approached the dock, I saw the crowd had grown. They were waiting for me, their faces a mix of relief and trepidation. Octavia was at the forefront, her green eyes wide with concern. "Ezra," she called out as I tied up the boat. "Are you all right? Did you see it?" I nodded, unable to meet her gaze. "I saw it," I said quietly, "and I learned things." A hush fell over the assembled townspeople. They knew, on some level, what our ancestors had done, but knowing and understanding are two very different things. Thaddeus pushed his way to the front, his craggy face set in grim lines. "Well, boy, out with it. What did the Deep One tell you?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "It's not a curse," I began, my voice gaining strength as I spoke. "It's a bargain, a pact made long ago, to keep our town safe and prosperous. But the price..." I trailed off, unable to voice the horrible truth, but I didn't need to. Understanding dawned on their faces, followed quickly by horror, denial, and finally, resignation. Octavia reached out, taking my hand in hers. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I looked out over the crowd, seeing the fear in their eyes, the weight of generations of secrecy and sacrifice, and I made a decision. "We do what we've always done," I said, my voice carrying across the suddenly silent docks. "We survive, we endure, and we pray that our bargain holds." As the crowd began to disperse, murmuring amongst themselves, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The entity beneath the waves had revealed itself to me in a way it never had before. Why now? What had changed? And more importantly, what would it ask of us next? As I walked back into town, the weight of knowledge heavy on my shoulders, I couldn't help but feel that Blackwater Cove was standing on the precipice of something vast and terrible. The old bargain was shifting, evolving, and I feared that we might not be prepared for what was to come. But for now, life would go on. The fog would roll in, the tide would turn, and the Deep One would hunger, and we, the people of Blackwater Cove, would continue our ancient dance with forces beyond our comprehension, praying that our steps never falter. For in this cosmic ballet, a single misstep could mean the end of everything we know. As night fell over Blackwater Cove, an uneasy silence settled upon the town. The revelations of the day had shaken everyone to their core, and I could feel the weight of unasked questions hanging in the air like the ever-present fog. I found myself wandering the empty streets, unable to face the confines of my small apartment. The rhythmic crash of waves against the shore provided a constant backdrop to my tumultuous thoughts. As I passed by the old town hall, a flicker of light from within caught my eye. Approaching cautiously, I peered through one of the grimy windows. Inside, I could make out a gathering of the town's elders: Thaddeus, Mayor Cordelia Blackwood, Dr. Ilias Marsh, and a few others I recognized but couldn't name. Their faces were grave as they huddled around a table strewn with ancient-looking documents. A hand on my shoulder nearly made me jump out of my skin. I whirled around to find Octavia standing there, her eyes wide with concern. "Ezra," she whispered. "What are you doing out here?" I gestured toward the window. "Something's going on. The elders are meeting." Octavia's brow furrowed. "After what you told us today, I'm not surprised. But why all the secrecy?" Before I could respond, the town hall door creaked open. Mayor Blackwood's weathered face appeared in the gap, her steel-grey hair gleaming in the lamplight. "Ezra, Octavia," she said, her voice carrying a hint of resignation. "I suppose you'd better come in. There are things you need to know." Exchanging a nervous glance, Octavia and I followed the mayor into the musty interior of the town hall. The other elders looked up as we entered, their expressions a mix of wariness and something that looked unsettlingly like pity. "Sit down, both of you," Thaddeus growled, gesturing to a pair of empty chairs. As we took our seats, "Doctor," Marsh cleared his throat. "Ezra, what you experienced today, it's not unprecedented. Every few generations, the entity reveals more of itself to one of us, usually to a member of your family line." I felt a chill run down my spine. "My father." Mayor Blackwood nodded solemnly. "And your grandfather before him. The Winthrop family has long been favored, if that's the right word, by the creature beneath the waves." "But why?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What makes us special?" The elders exchanged uneasy glances before Thaddeus spoke up. "It goes back to the founding of Blackwater Cove. Your ancestor, Jeremiah Winthrop, was the one who first made contact with the entity. He struck the original bargain." Octavia leaned forward, her face pale in the flickering lamplight. "What exactly was this bargain? What did Jeremiah promise?" "Doctor," Marsh sighed heavily, "protection for the town, bountiful fish in our waters, and safety from the storms that plague this coast. In exchange," he trailed off, unable to continue. "In exchange for sacrifices," I finished, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Mayor Blackwood nodded grimly. "At first, it was fish and livestock, but as the years passed, the entity's appetite changed, grew. The implications hung in the air, unspoken but understood by all. I thought of the disappearances over the years, the strange meat we used as bait, the sounds from the old cannery. My stomach churned. "But why tell us this now?" Octavia asked, her voice shaking slightly. "Why break generations of secrecy?" Thaddeus leaned forward, his rheumy eyes fixed on me. "Because the bargain is changing. Boy, you felt it today, didn't you? The entity is evolving. Its hunger is growing." I nodded slowly, remembering the alien presence that had invaded my mind. It said the next offering is due soon, but it felt different this time. More urgent. Mayor Blackwood stood, pacing the length of the room. "We've managed to keep the worst of it contained for generations, limiting the sacrifices to those who wouldn't be missed. Drifters, the occasional tourist. But I fear that soon, that won't be enough." A heavy silence fell over the room as the implications of her words sank in. Finally, Octavia spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. "So what do we do?" "Doctor," Marsh spread his hands in a gesture of helplessness. "We don't know. The old methods, the rituals passed down through the generations, they may not be enough anymore. We need to find a new way to appease the entity." Or what?" I demanded, a spark of anger cutting through my fear. "We let it destroy the town, unleash it on the world." Thaddeus slammed his gnarled fist on the table. "Of course not, boy, but we're running out of options, and time." Mayor Blackwood turned to face us, her expression grave. "That's why we've decided to bring you two into our confidence. Ezra, as a Winthrop, you have a connection to the entity that none of us can fully understand. And Octavia, your family's knowledge of the old ways, the forgotten lore, it may be our only hope of finding a solution." I felt the weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders like a physical burden. Beside me, Octavia sat up straighter, a determined glint in her eye. "Where do we start?" she asked. "Doctor," Marsh gestured to the pile of documents on the table. These are all the records we have of past encounters, rituals, and offerings. Some date back to the town's founding. We need to go through them. Look for any clues or patterns that might help us understand what's changing and how to adapt. As we began to sift through the yellowed papers and crumbling ledgers, a sense of urgency filled the room. Outside, the fog thickened, and the distant cry of the foghorn seemed to take on a mournful, almost plaintive tone. We worked through the night, poring over accounts of past sacrifices, deciphering cryptic notes left by long-dead town elders, and trying to piece together a coherent picture of the entity's nature and desires. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the grimy windows, I sat back, rubbing my tired eyes. "There's something here," I muttered, more to myself than the others. Some pattern we're not seeing. Octavia looked up from the tome she was studying, her red hair disheveled from hours of work. "What do you mean?" I shook my head, frustrated. "I don't know. It's just a feeling, like we're missing some crucial piece of information." Mayor Blackwood, who had been douncing in a corner, stirred at my words. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "it's time we visited the old lighthouse." The others in the room stiffened at her words. Thaddeus opened his mouth as if to protest, but a sharp look from the mayor silenced him. "The lighthouse?" I asked, confused. "What's so special about it?" "Doctor," Marsh cleared his throat nervously, "the old lighthouse has been abandoned for decades. It's said to be, well, cursed, even more so than the rest of the town." Octavia's eyes widened in realization. "The keeper's logs. Of course, the lighthouse keeper would have had a unique vantage point, both literally and figuratively." Mayor Blackwood nodded grimly. "Exactly. If there are answers to be found, they may well be hidden in those logs. But I warn you, the lighthouse is not a place to be taken lightly. There's a reason we've kept it off limits all these years." As I looked around the room at the faces of the town elders, I could see a mixture of fear and resignation in their eyes. Whatever secrets the lighthouse held, they were clearly terrified of what we might uncover. But we were out of options. With the entity's hunger growing and the old bargain failing, we needed answers. And if those answers lay within the crumbling walls of the abandoned lighthouse, then that's where we had to go. "When do we leave?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "As soon as the tide turns," Mayor Blackwood replied, her voice heavy with the weight of unspoken fears. "May God have mercy on your souls." As we began to gather supplies for our journey to the lighthouse, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were about to uncover something that would change Blackwater Cove forever. Whether for better or worse remained to be seen. The fog outside seemed to thicken, as if in response to our plans, and in the distance, I swore I could hear something massive stirring beneath the waves. Our time was running out, and the secrets of the lighthouse beckoned. Little did we know that the horrors we had faced so far were merely a prelude to the cosmic terrors that awaited us in the abandoned tower by the sea. As we approached the dilapidated lighthouse, the fog seemed to part before us, as if granting us passage. The ancient structure loomed above, its paint long since weathered away, leaving behind a skeletal frame that creaked and groaned in the salty breeze. Octavia and I exchanged a nervous glance before pushing open the rusted door. The interior was a mess of cobwebs and decay, but our eyes were drawn to a heavy iron trapdoor in the floor, secured with a padlock that looked far too new. "This wasn't here before," Mayor Blackwood muttered, producing a key from her pocket. "We had it installed years ago, to keep people out, and perhaps to keep something in." The lock clicked open, and we descended into the darkness below. The beam of our flashlights revealed a circular room, its walls covered in strange, undulating symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the flickering light. In the center stood a pedestal, upon which rested a leather-bound book, the Keeper's Log. As I reached for it, a chill ran down my spine, and I heard a faint whisper, as if the very air around us was alive with secrets. We spent hours poring over the log, deciphering the increasingly manic scribblings of generations of lighthouse keepers. As we read, a terrifying picture began to emerge. The entity beneath the waves was no mere creature, but a fragment of something far vaster and more incomprehensible. It had been drawn to our reality by the cosmic alignments that occurred at the founding of Blackwater Cove, and the original bargain had bound it to this place. But that binding was weakening. With each passing year, each sacrifice, the entity grew stronger, more aware. It was not content to merely exist in our world. It wanted to fully manifest, to draw more of its unfathomable bulk into our reality. "This is why the bargain is changing," Octavia whispered, her face pale in the dim light. "It's preparing for something bigger." As if in response to her words, the ground beneath us began to tremble. From somewhere far below, we heard a sound that was part roar, part scream, and wholly alien. "It knows we're here," I said, my heart pounding. "It knows we've discovered the truth." Mayor Blackwood's face was grim as she turned to us. "Then we have no choice. We must complete the ritual described in these pages. It's the only way to reinforce the binding and push the entity back." The ritual was complex and horrifying, requiring blood from a Winthrop and words in a language that hurt to pronounce. As we prepared, I could feel the entity's rage building, the very air around us growing thick and oppressive. With trembling hands, I cut my palm, letting the blood drip onto the symbols etched into the floor. Octavia began to chant, her voice growing in strength as the words took on a life of their own. The room began to spin, reality itself seeming to warp and bend around us. I caught glimpses of impossible geometries, of vast, dark spaces between the stars, and through it all, I felt the entity's presence, ancient, vast, and utterly alien. For a moment that stretched into eternity, we teetered on the brink of oblivion. The entity raged against the bindings, its fury threatening to tear apart the very fabric of our world. But then, slowly, inexorably, I felt it begin to recede. The symbols on the walls flared with eldritch light, and I heard a sound like the universe itself groaning in protest. And then, suddenly, it was over. We collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. The oppressive presence was gone, replaced by a stillness that felt almost holy in its intensity. Is it done?" Octavia asked, her voice hoarse. Mayor Blackwood nodded slowly, her eyes wide with a mixture of relief and residual terror. "For now, we've bought ourselves some time, reinforced the old bindings, but it's not over." I finished for her. "It'll never truly be over, will it?" She shook her head sadly. "No, Ezra, this is the burden we bear, the price we pay for our town's existence. We've pushed back the darkness for now, but it will always be there, waiting." As we emerged from the lighthouse, I was struck by how normal everything looked. The fog had lifted, and I could see fishing boats heading out to sea, their crews unaware of the cosmic horror we had just faced. In the days that followed, life in Blackwater Cove slowly returned to what passed for normal. The fish returned to our waters, and the oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the town began to lift. But for those of us who knew the truth, things would never be the same. We had glimpsed something beyond human comprehension, and that knowledge weighed heavily upon us. The entity was contained for now, but we knew it was still there, lurking beneath the waves, biding its time. As I stood on the docks one evening, watching the sun set over the ocean, Octavia joined me. She slipped her hand into mine, a gesture of comfort and shared understanding. "Do you think we'll ever be free of it?" she asked quietly. I sighed, looking out at the seemingly peaceful waters. "I don't know. Maybe someday we'll find a way to break the bargain for good. Or maybe this is just our lot in life, to stand guard against the darkness, to keep the rest of the world safe from what lies beneath." She nodded, leaning her head on my shoulder. "At least we're not alone in this anymore." As we stood there, I felt a complex mix of emotions wash over me. Relief at having averted disaster, pride in our small town's resilience, and a deep, abiding sense of responsibility. But underneath it all was a current of dread, a knowledge that our victory was temporary at best. The entity would return, its hunger renewed, and when it did, we would be here, ready to face it again, for that was the true curse of Blackwater Cove. Not the bargain itself, but the burden of knowing what lurked just beyond the veil of our reality. As the last light faded from the sky, I squeezed Octavia's hand, drawing strength from her presence. Whatever came next, we would face it together, and for now, that was enough. The sea stretched out before us, calm and inscrutable, keeping its secrets hidden beneath the waves, and somewhere in its depths, something ancient and vast waited, dreaming of the day it would rise again. It was a sort of moor sound, something that could only be pronounced with human lips. It came from the grass. Something was babbling in the grass. The sound sent a chill down my spine. The creature that crawled out of the crate this morning, the same creature that me and Dr. Moss beat to death and set on fire, it made those exact sounds. It didn't look like the one we saw this morning, the old scientist says. It was shaped like a person. Its lips were still huge and fat, and its skin was covered in insect eyes and strange flowers, but it had arms and legs. The thing crawled out of the grass, babbled at me with its inflamed lips, and then died. Willow noted another flurry of thoughts in his notebook. Kamer, on the other hand, was full of promise. He celebrated how the grass had managed to create a living, breathing creature. Sure, it died right on the spot, but there was research yet to be done. With a little funding, Willow's technology could be adjusted for organisms that could survive past a couple breaths, for livestock, for more solutions to world hunger. Before Kamer could start to speak about the intricacies of funding and how my connections might help, I told the man to stop talking. I was filled with shock and awe and confusion, yet as I looked at that grey, lifeless thing lying by my feet, I was overwhelmed with disgust. Willow had created a living thing out of thin air just to watch it die. The breed of science he was interested in was nothing man should ever touch. I ordered both Kamer and Willow out of the facility. Thompson would call them a cab. I had no interest in letting the two men back into my car. I spent most of the night burning any evidence of Willow's demented science, and when the soil in the courtyard kept on sprouting grass, I had it replaced with cement. All I kept from that night was a sample of one of the flowers, and that was purely because I wanted to assure myself the whole night was not mere phantasm. Kamer never wrote to me again. A couple years after that night, however, I received a slim envelope with a letter written on Pokeman stationery. It was from Henry Willow. The message he had for me was curt, yet the entire letter was bunched up into a corner of the page as to not cover any of the creatures in the background. Willow and Kamer had found a safe refuge out east at the United People's Institute of Science. The institute would help facilitate Willow's research, and its true potential could be reached. Willow would prove me wrong and engineer living creatures into existence. He would create life and prove me wrong. He would prove me wrong, and when the final century came, him and his beasts would rule the earth. Out of curiosity, I looked up this United People's Institute of Science. It was an old Soviet research facility, and there was sparse information about it. The only thing I could find out was that it got shut down in '92. Maria, I still had so many questions, but I so desperately wanted to forget. With the little I knew about the Institute, I decided it was closed and that Willow was a madman destined to fail. I decided to let the whole affair out of my head, and now, his words drift again. The machines he is hooked up to start to quicken their pace once more. I tell him it's okay. I tell him we're safe. He shakes his head again. And now we just have to hope we never see Professor Willow's vision of the final century come to fruition. Thank you for venturing into the darkness with us. If you dare to explore further, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more spine-tingling tales of horror and the supernatural. Remember, the shadows hold endless mysteries, waiting to be unveiled. Stay tuned for more bone-chilling stories as we continue to traverse the eerie depths of the unknown together. Until next time, May your dreams be free from the haunting echoes of our tales. Or perhaps not.